They wore crowns, held empires, and signed death warrants with trembling hands. But behind the thrones and portraits, their minds were kingdoms of their own, fractured, haunted, sometimes lost entirely. This isn't history as triumph. It's history as unraveling. From whispered delusions in marble halls to kings who feared their bodies were made of glass, these are the royals who ruled while reality slipped through their fingers. 30 monarchs, 30 fractured minds, and not one happy ending. Welcome to 30 royals who were mentally ill, because absolute power doesn't just corrupt. Sometimes it forgets what planet it's on. Before we dive headfirst into royal breakdowns and dynasties on the brink, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because you won't want to miss what we're about to uncover. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who's wandering the halls of history with us, no matter how late the hour. Charles VI of France, 1368-1422. They called him Charles the Beloved, until they didn't. By the time he died in 1422, he was known across France as Charles the Mad, a poetic downgrade, really, and one that says more about power than it does about illness. Charles VI was born into a throne already teetering. France in the late 14th century was war-ravaged, exhausted by the 100 Years' War, and spiritually haunted by the Black Death. Charles took the crown at the age of 11, and by 21 he was poised to be the saviour monarch the kingdom so desperately needed. Handsome, charismatic, intelligent, he was everything a court propagandist could ask for. But underneath the gilded robes and ceremonial Latin, something fragile was already fraying. The first recorded sign that something was off came in 1392. He was leading a military expedition to Brittany when, seemingly out of nowhere, he erupted. Not politically, not metaphorically, but physically and violently. A page dropped a lance, and Charles, startled, drew his sword and turned on his own men, slaying several before he was subdued. When he regained consciousness, he reportedly had no memory of what happened. That was the first break. It would not be the last. From that point on, Charles became something of a case study in royal dysfunction, spiraling into periodic fits of psychosis, paranoia, and delusion. At times, he would wander the halls of his palace, refusing to bathe, snarling at attendants, and insisting he was made of glass, literally. In his infamous glass delusion, Charles believed he would shatter if touched. He reportedly had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent breakage. Let that image settle in. A king armoured, not for battle, but for the fragile geometry of his own mind. The court, of course, did what courts do best, whispered, manoeuvred, and staged power plays behind his back. A regency was quietly imposed. Noble factions jostled for influence under the pretense of caring for the monarch's well-being. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, found herself in a political and emotional no man's land. At times, she ruled as de facto regent. At others, she was vilified as the manipulative foreign queen, exploiting her husband's madness. In truth, she was navigating a collapsing royal court built on eggshells and glass. There's something uniquely medieval about the way Charles's illness was treated. Physicians blamed it on hot humours, demonic possession, even witchcraft. Remedies included herbal concoctions, bloodletting, and pilgrimages to holy sites. None of it helped. Over the next 3 decades, Charles's condition would become cyclical, months of lucidity, followed by sudden descents into incoherence. These weren't just moody episodes. They were full-blown breaks from reality. He often failed to recognize his own children. He barked like a dog. He accused his most loyal servants of plotting against him. One chronicler noted that Charles once sat for days, completely still, refusing to speak or move, as though time itself had paused to honor his unraveling mind. And yet France carried on. That's the strange part. Armies marched. Treaties were signed. Taxes were collected. The monarchy didn't collapse under the weight of Charles's madness. It adapted to it. Like a dysfunctional family that learns to tiptoe around the screaming room in the attic. And maybe that's the most chilling part of the story. How normal it became. The man in the iron-reinforced robes, babbling about glass bones, hallucinating conspiracies, believing himself cursed he was still king, his seal still ratified laws, his name still appeared on coins. Madness wasn't a disqualification, it was a feature of divine rule. After all, who's to say what sanity looks like when your job description includes appointed by God? In one of the more surreal ironies of his reign, during one of his rare lucid periods, Charles helped institute a royal ordinance meant to reduce corruption in the court. It worked briefly, then he slipped again. The reforms unraveled, and the schemers returned to their posts like moths to a candle they hoped would never stop flickering. Charles died in 1422, after nearly 30 years of intermittent psychosis. His reign left France internally fractured, morally shaken, and ripe for the next phase of the 100 Years' War. The king was dead. But the madness wasn't. Because the thing about madness, especially when it wears a crown, is that it never really dies. It travels, it slips through bloodlines, it hides behind thrones, and whispers into the ears of successors. And the next successor was no stranger to whispers. He heard them, too. Sometimes for days. Sometimes for months. Sometimes forever. Henry VI of England, 1421, 1471. History tends to remember kings as either conquerors or catastrophes. Henry VI managed to be neither and both. He was born into a throne built from borrowed glory. His father, Henry V, had carved out English victories in France that still echoed like war songs across the Channel. But Henry V died young, leaving behind a 9-month-old baby as king of both England and France. It was less a coronation than an inheritance wrapped in disaster. From the moment Henry VI took his first breath, he was expected to hold together 2 kingdoms, dozens of lords, and centuries of dynastic baggage. And for a while, the grown-ups did their best. Regents ran the country. Noble councils kept the peace. Tutors filled the boy, king's head with scripture and Latin. But even in his youth, Henry showed signs of something not quite right. He was devout, pathologically so. He recoiled from violence, clung to prayers like they were armor, and showed more interest in monks than military matters. In a medieval world where piety was power, that might have been fine, but this was a monarch in the middle of a war. Devotion only gets you so far when your crown is half drenched in blood. By his 20s, Henry's behaviour was starting to draw nervous glances from the court. He would drift into long silences. He spoke softly, mechanically, as if quoting lines from a forgotten play. He avoided eye contact. He forgot names sometimes of his closest allies. It was the kind of quiet that makes people start speaking in whispers, and behind the whispers, fear. Then came 1453, the year that shattered what was left of the illusion. News arrived from France. The English had lost Bordeaux. It was the symbolic end of the 100 Years' War. England's dreams of continental empire had finally collapsed, and with them, Henry's fragile grip on reality. He broke. For over a year, Henry VI didn't speak. Not a word, not a murmur. He didn't respond to anyone, not even when his wife, Margaret of Anjou, gave birth to their son. The king met the news with vacant eyes and silence. Doctors tried everything: tonics, chants, herbs, holy relics. Nothing pierced the fog. And here's where the real trouble begins. Power abhors a vacuum, and a catatonic king is a black hole. Enter Richard, Duke of York, a man with a royal blood claim and no patience for a monarch who stares at walls. Parliament named York protector of the realm. Queen Margaret, understandably, was not pleased. Lines were drawn, loyalties tested, swords sharpened. Thus began the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic blood feud between two branches of the Plantagenet family, spiraling across decades, bodies, and generations. When Henry finally recovered, it wasn't triumph, it was tragedy. He had returned to a country that had learned to live without him. Worse, many preferred it that way. His moments of lucidity became brief and fragile. Eyewitnesses describe a man who spoke in circular phrases, often contradictory, sometimes eerily serene. He would weep during council meetings. He showed no anger, even when betrayed. There's a melancholy purity to that, like a lamb trying to govern a pack of wolves. And Margaret? She took the reins. Fierce, ambitious, and politically shrewd, she did what Henry couldn't or wouldn't. She defended their son's inheritance, raised armies, made alliances, and fought like a woman who knew the throne would not protect a weak man forever. But even she couldn't hold back the tide. Henry was deposed in 1461 by Edward IV, a Yorkist, who sent the mentally unwell king into confinement. There, Henry spent several years muttering psalms to himself, sometimes believing he was still king, sometimes believing he was not. In a bizarre twist of political whiplash, he was briefly restored to the throne in 1470, only to be deposed again months later. It was like watching a puppet being dusted off and rehung in a window, long after the shop had closed. He died in the Tower of London in 1471, under what were officially labelled uncertain circumstances. The story we're meant to believe is that grief killed him after hearing of his son's death in battle. The story most historians believe is something colder, that someone decided England no longer needed a ghost for a king. But if Henry VI was a ghost, he was one that haunted more than walls. His reign left behind a trail of questions no coronation can answer. What happens when a king is too gentle for his crown? When sanctity becomes a liability? When illness is not punished but performed across a national stage? He was a king who couldn't rule, a man who couldn't fight, a soul who couldn't rest. And yet, in the centuries since, some have canonized him. Literally, Saint Henry, a royal martyr of mental fragility, a warning, a prayer. Still, England would learn the hard way that removing a mad king doesn't prevent madness. Sometimes it just puts a sharper sword in someone else's hand, and the next to wield one would not pray over it. She would scream through it. And she would outlive nearly all of them. 2 monarchs down, 28 to go, and we're just getting warmed up. If you're still with us, it means you're exactly the kind of night-minded history sleuth we like having around. So make it official, hit that subscribe button, and join the court of curious minds. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it? Is it dusk in Dublin or sunrise in Singapore? We want to know who else is up late unraveling royal psyches with us. Joanna of Castile, Juana la Loca, 1479-1555. They called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But what they didn't say, at least not in public, was that her madness was extraordinarily convenient. Born in 1479 to Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the same Isabella who financed Columbus and launched the Inquisition, Joanna entered a world of empires, dogmas, and dynasties that measured sanity by usefulness. She was the third child, never expected to inherit anything more than a religious life or a symbolic marriage. But then fate, as it often does in royal courts, started pruning branches. Her older siblings died one by one, first her brother, then her sister, then her nephew. And just like that, the girl who was once politically disposable became heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe. And that's when the walls started to move. But let's start earlier, before the rumors, before the locked doors. Joanna was highly educated, multilingual, musically gifted, intellectually sharp. Even her enemies admitted she was brilliant. But brilliance is brittle in a world of alliances, and at the age of 16, she was shipped off to the Low Countries to marry Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. Handsome, yes. Also vain, promiscuous, calculating. The marriage was realpolitik, dressed up in silk. And yet Joanna fell in love. Tragically, recklessly, destructively in love. While Philip collected mistresses like trophies, Joanna's attachment to him deepened into something the court didn't have a name for. She burned with jealousy. Not metaphorically, servants recorded physical outbursts, episodes of obsessive behavior, days spent weeping, refusing food. But was it madness? Or was it the kind of heartbreak the 15th century didn't know how to interpret? Court officials began to whisper. They said she was hysterical, possessed, unfit. But the record shows something stranger. Joanna continued to carry out her royal duties, draft letters, receive ambassadors, and manage households, all while being labelled insane. If she was mad, she was maddeningly functional. Then Philip died suddenly in 1506 at age 28. Some say it was typhoid, others poison. But the moment of his death would define Joanna's entire legacy. She collapsed, screamed, refused to be separated from his corpse, ordered it embalmed and placed in a lead coffin. And for months, yes, months, she allegedly travelled with the coffin through the Castilian countryside, opening it to kiss the body, refusing to allow women near it, accusing clergy and courtiers of trying to steal him from her. This is the moment historians point to when they say here, this is madness. But pause, think, is this madness or grief? Unchecked, undiagnosed, perhaps even manipulated grief. Because while Joanna was in mourning, the men around her were making moves. Her father Ferdinand declared her unfit to rule and seized the regency. Her son, Charles, future emperor of half of Europe, would later do the same. Each time she showed resistance, she was isolated. Each time she spoke up, her words were dismissed as ravings. Even when she signed royal decrees and received noble delegations, they claimed she was a puppet. Even when she wrote coherent letters and pleaded for her release, they said she didn't know what she was saying. What's disturbing is how early the narrative calcified. From her 20s to her 70s, Joanna lived under house arrest, first under her father's watch in Tordesillas, then under her son's. A queen in name only, a prisoner with a crown. One contemporary chronicler noted that she would sometimes appear at windows, staring out at nothing, whispering prayers under her breath. Or perhaps not prayers, perhaps just fragments of memory. We don't know. She was given no voice, only diagnosis. And yet, the paperwork bearing her seal continued for decades. Monarchs ruled through her authority while denying her agency. Her body was confined, but her name moved armies. She was both a legal requirement and a political liability. A ghost in her own reign. The tragedy is not simply that Joanna may have suffered from mental illness, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. No one agrees. The tragedy is how convenient her suffering was to those around her. Her father needed her mad, her son needed her silent, and history, well, history loves a mad queen. Juana la Loca became folklore, a cautionary tale, a Gothic footnote to the Spanish Empire's rise. But there are letters still preserved in archives where Joanna writes not as a madwoman, but as a mother, a queen, a betrayed woman, clear, articulate, lucid, and ignored. She died in 1555 after nearly 50 years of confinement, half a century of being declared too unstable to walk freely, but just stable enough to legitimize an empire. That's not madness. That's strategy, just not hers. But the idea of a royal woman who refuses to break, who clings to lost love like a political act that's threatening, and when grief threatens power, it's always renamed madness. Which brings us to another monarch, one who also wept too long, loved too much, and ruled under the shadow of suspicion. But this one, he was a man. And so, his madness was a different kind of spectacle. George III of Great Britain, 1738-1820. By the end of his life, George III was known not for what he ruled, but for what he lost America, his mind, and finally, the ability to tell the two apart. He came to the throne in 1760, young, eager, and famously sober in an era of gin-soaked aristocrats. Unlike many of his predecessors, George was devout, dutiful, and genuinely interested in governing. He read obsessively, took meticulous notes, and tried to involve himself in the day-to-day operations of the empire. He was a man who believed in moral order, divine responsibility, and the power of reason. But the trouble with reason is that once it starts to slip, the descent looks like treason to those around you. The official narrative of George's reign usually begins with the American Revolution and ends with regency, madness, and a shadow monarchy. But somewhere in that timeline, something fractured, and like most royal fractures, it happened behind closed doors first. George's first major mental breakdown came in 1788. One morning, he began speaking at unusual length. Then he didn't stop. For days. He would talk for hours, moving rapidly from topic to topic, often incoherent, sometimes shockingly articulate. He reportedly wrote over 100 letters in a single day. His doctors described it as incessant loquacity. Today, we might call it pressured speech, a classic symptom of mania. Alongside this came insomnia, paranoia, and vivid delusions. He thought people were plotting against him. He screamed obscenities unusual for a man previously so composed. He once apologized to a tree for bumping into it. He babbled about religious revelations and cosmic visions. And then, just as dramatically, he collapsed into catatonia, barely able to speak at all. The country was shaken. Parliament debated installing a regent. Rumours flew. His courtiers panicked. His wife, Queen Charlotte, feared for her safety, and that of their 15 children. Yes, 15. George was nothing if not reproductively committed. But then, miraculously, confusingly, he recovered. For a time. And this is where the story turns. Because George's madness wasn't a straight line. It came in waves, sometimes years apart, sometimes more subtle than the last. After each episode, he would return to a version of himself, lucid, kind, painfully aware of what had happened. And that may have been the cruelest part. He remembered enough to feel ashamed. Historians and doctors have long debated the cause. For centuries, the favored theory was porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system. It would have explained his gastrointestinal pain, his discolored urine, his hallucinations. But recent scholarship leans toward a psychiatric diagnosis, bipolar disorder, perhaps complicated by other neurological factors. The reality is, we don't know. And part of the reason we don't know is that every diagnosis then and now was filtered through the politics of monarchy. Because madness in a king is never just madness, it's instability, it's weakness, it's opportunity. During George's second major breakdown in 1801, he reportedly became obsessed with clocks. He would reset them constantly, believing that time itself was out of order. He also insisted on attending cabinet meetings, even when he could no longer follow the discussions. Ministers placated him, nodded politely, then made decisions behind his back. By 1810, following the death of his youngest and favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, George deteriorated rapidly. He wandered the halls of Windsor Castle, often blind, sometimes babbling, sometimes silent for days. He claimed to speak with angels. He mistook furniture for members of his court. He became a spectral presence, alive but unreachable. And so, in 1811, Parliament formally passed the Regency Act. His son, the flamboyant and famously indulgent George, Prince of Wales, was appointed Prince Regent, ushering in the period now known as the Regency era. While the father lingered in mental twilight, the son ruled with parties, debts, and a total lack of irony. George III lived another 9 years, most of them in darkness. Blind, deaf, and intermittently delusional, he resided at Windsor, playing music only he could hear. Servants reported that he would sometimes hold imaginary conversations with long-dead ministers, or pray aloud for the return of his beloved colonies. To the outside world, he became less man than metaphor, a living reminder of the costs of power, the fragility of reason, and the uneasy intersection of monarchy and mental illness. His image was even sanitized. Portraits showed him stern and regal. Coins bore his profile with steady gaze. The king's madness was treated like a national embarrassment, a polite secret kept behind velvet curtains. And yet, among the public, there was a strange affection for him. He was seen not as cruel or dangerous, but tragic. His illness made him human. His suffering made him familiar. He became the farmer king, the man who lost America but kept his dignity, a monarch not feared but pitied, which is, in its own way, another kind of throne. But not every royal breakdown ends in pity. Some curdle into something else entirely, something darker. Because while George clung to sanity like a raft in a storm, the next royal never even pretended to swim. Maria, I of Portugal, 1734, 1816. They called her Maria the Pious, though not always kindly. In Lisbon's palaces, her prayers echoed longer than her policies, and behind the velvet curtains, her servants learned to distinguish between silence and a storm. For Maria, I of Portugal, faith was not just ritual, it was refuge, and in time, it became a cage. Born into the gilded fragility of the Portuguese monarchy in 1734, Maria Francisca Isabel was raised with all the trappings of royal dignity and none of its guarantees. As a child, she watched the 1755 Lisbon earthquake destroy more than just buildings. It ruptured the kingdom's confidence. Tens of thousands were killed in moments. Fire swallowed what the tremor spared. Churches crumbled. The Inquisition declared it divine punishment. The Prime Minister blamed fate. The King, her father, never emotionally recovered. Maria watched all of this from behind embroidered curtains and took detailed mental notes. God was terrifying. The world was unstable. And kings could break. In 1777, she became the first undisputed queen regnant of Portugal, ruling in her own right, no husband to share the crown. Her accession was popular, especially because her father's long reign had stagnated under the iron-fisted rule of the Marquis of Pombal, a man Maria despised. One of her first acts was to dismiss him, undo his reforms, and exile him. Justice, perhaps, or revenge. The line between the two was already starting to blur. At first, Maria's reign seemed like a return to moral decency. She reopened convents, emphasized traditional piety, and reasserted the moral authority of the Catholic Church. Diplomats called her devout. Subjects called her our Maria. And yet whispers began early. She cried too often, they said. She had nervous episodes. She was melancholic, withdrawn. In court, she would drift into long silences, barely responding to ministers. At night, servants heard her pacing and praying until dawn. Her moods were volatile, swinging from joyous exaltation to immobilizing despair. She began suffering from what her physicians called hysterical fits. Today, we'd likely describe it as severe depression or bipolar disorder. But diagnosis, then as now, was not just about health. It was about control. Her mental health began to decline dramatically in the 1780 seconds, especially after the death of her husband and uncle, King Pedro III. They had been close by dynastic standards. His death, followed by the deaths of her eldest son and her confessor, pushed Maria into a psychological tailspin. The court's official explanation was grief, but her grief was unending and loud. She screamed, she wept, she prayed with such intensity it unsettled even the priests. She began claiming to see visions, religious hallucinations, apocalyptic declarations. Some reports say she believed she was damned, others that she believed the Virgin Mary was speaking through her. Ministers attempted to shield her from public view, but rumors slipped through the corridors like incense. By 1792, Maria was declared insane and deemed unfit to rule. Her surviving son, João, later João VI, took over as Prince Regent. But she remained queen in title, and that title mattered. All state decisions were still made in her name. It was a royal fiction, and everyone agreed to live inside it. Except Maria. Her condition worsened over time. British doctors summoned with great expense and secrecy were unable to help. In fact, their treatments may have made things worse. They prescribed purges, bloodletting, and confinement. Maria's religious obsessions intensified. Her emotional volatility sharpened. By the early 1800 seconds, she had become a figure of mystery and dread in the court. She rarely appeared in public. When she did, she looked vacant, wild-eyed, muttering to herself. And then came the next disaster, Napoleon. In 1807, as French forces advanced into Iberia, the Portuguese royal family fled Lisbon under British naval protection and sailed across the Atlantic to Brazil, a whole European monarchy exiled by cannon and ambition. Maria, now in full mental collapse, was carried aboard the ship as a shadow of her former self, drugged and isolated. They arrived in Rio de Janeiro and declared it the new capital of the Portuguese Empire. For a decade, Brazil became the beating heart of Portuguese politics. João ruled as regent. Maria remained hidden away in the royal palace, under heavy guard. she never adjusted to life in Brazil. The heat, the foreignness, the distance from the cathedrals of Lisbon, all of it unmoored her further. Some sources claim she believed she was already in hell. And yet, even in Brazil, the fiction held. Maria was still Queen of Portugal, formally reigning over an empire that had moved continents. She died in 1816 in Rio, far from the granite churches of her youth, far from the throne that had both crowned and confined her. Her body was eventually returned to Lisbon, but her legacy remained trapped in a question that would follow many monarchs after her. What happens when a crown must be worn, even by someone who can no longer carry it? Maria was not overthrown. She was not deposed. She was not locked in a tower and forgotten. She remained queen while unwell for nearly 24 years, and that is not just history, it's precedent. Because in monarchy, the mind is less important than the illusion. And sometimes, to keep that illusion alive, they will quietly hand the scepter to someone else. Someone who never wanted it, never asked for it, and was never prepared for what it meant to rule in another's name. And the man who followed Maria's son knew better than anyone what inherited power does to the brain. His brother Otto would prove that quite dramatically. Otto, King of Bavaria, 1848-1916. Otto of Bavaria was born into a world already drenched in theatre, waltzes and uniforms, velvet and ritual, public faces behind private veils. He was a prince of the Wittelsbach dynasty, younger brother to the famously eccentric Ludwig II, and second in line to a throne that was beginning to look more like a stage set than a seat of power. He never expected to be king, and in a way, he never really was. Otto Friedrich Wilhelm Ludwig was born in 1848, just as Europe was convulsing with revolution. While barricades went up in Paris and Vienna, Bavaria tightened its royal buttons and hoped that decorum could outrun dissent. Otto grew up in the shadow of royal duty and artistic ambition, surrounded by courtiers who believed silence was virtue and appearances were everything. He was intelligent, sensitive, fluent in multiple languages, and if court diaries are to be believed, unusually gentle, which, of course, was seen as a problem. By the time Otto reached adulthood, he had already begun to show signs of emotional volatility. Not scandalous, not public, just enough to make the court physicians take quiet notes. He was melancholic, isolated, prone to long, unexplained absences from court life. There were reports of sudden outbursts, long silences, sleepless nights, but nothing definitive. Not yet. That changed in the 1870 seconds. During the Franco-Prussian War, Otto served briefly as a military officer. He was present at the siege of Paris and was reportedly disturbed deeply by what he saw. In his letters, he wrote not about strategy or glory, but about the suffering of civilians, the smell of death in the streets, and the absurdity of uniforms in the mud. He returned to Bavaria, withdrawn and changed. What came back was not a triumphant prince, but a haunted one. By 1875, Otto's mental health had deteriorated so noticeably that his brother, King Ludwig II, was forced to remove him from public life. Doctors declared him unfit for court duties. The official diagnosis? Mental illness. The unofficial story? No one was quite sure what to say. He wasn't dangerous, just unreachable. It's worth noting that this was the same Ludwig II who was himself under scrutiny for his own eccentricities. Ludwig, who built fantasy castles and talked to portraits, who staged operas in private and spent state funds on imaginary kingdoms. In many ways, Otto's descent into illness mirrored his brother's, but with far less spectacle. While Ludwig's instability was baroque, Otto's was bleak. Where Ludwig painted madness with gold leaf, Otto disappeared quietly into shadows. In 1886, Ludwig II was declared insane and removed from the throne under suspicious circumstances. Days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg, an event still debated, still soaked in mystery. With Ludwig gone, Otto became king, technically. But the crown passed to a man who had not spoken coherently in years. He did not attend his coronation. He did not sit on the throne. He did not sign royal decrees or appear at state functions. Instead, a regency was established under his uncle, Prince Luitpold, who ruled in Otto's name. It was a monarchy, in legal terms. Only Otto was king in title, but in practice, he was a ghost monarch. Bavaria had a ruler whose voice no one heard, whose presence no one saw, and whose mind no one could reach. Otto was confined to Fürstenried Palace on the outskirts of Munich, where he lived for the remaining 30 years of his life under strict supervision. Reports suggest he was calm, passive, and largely unresponsive. He spent his days in a repetitive routine, brief walks, supervised meals, long periods of staring out windows. Occasionally he would speak, but rarely in ways anyone understood. He showed no interest in governance, nor any recognition of his royal status. It's tempting to imagine Otto as tragic a man imprisoned by his own mind, but there's also something quietly political about his story. The Bavarian state had no intention of allowing a mentally ill monarch to re-enter the stage. They needed stability, optics, continuity, so they created an elegant fiction. Otto was king, yes, but only ceremonially. The real decisions would be made by others, and as long as everyone agreed to that arrangement, the machine could keep turning. He remained legally king until 1913, when political pressures finally made the arrangement untenable. A constitutional amendment deposed him gently, officially, and with ceremonial regret. His cousin Ludwig, Prince Regent since 1912, became King Ludwig III. Otto, by then long silent, was not informed. He died 3 years later, in 1916, during the height of the First World War. Europe was burning, empires were collapsing, and Otto of Bavaria, a man who once rode into war and returned broken, slipped away without fanfare. No public mourning, no national crisis. Just another quiet death in a palace that had long since stopped mattering. Otto's story is not one of madness flamboyantly displayed. It is the story of madness carefully hidden, quietly managed, and institutionally domesticated. His was a reign that never happened, a king who never ruled, and a life curated into harmlessness. But sometimes, harmlessness is only surface tension, because just one royal prior to Otto had made it impossible for Bavaria or the world to ignore the fragile boundary between delusion and pageantry. And unlike Otto, Ludwig II did not go quietly. Ludwig II of Bavaria, 1845-1886. Ludwig II of Bavaria never ruled, he curated. His kingdom was not Bavaria, but beauty. He governed in arches, fog, and orchestras, marble towers instead of ministers, swan-shaped gondolas instead of armies, and while his people called him the fairy tale king, those closest to him whispered a different name. Der verrückte König, the Mad King. He preferred the first. Born in 1845 at Nymphenburg Palace, Ludwig entered the world already mythologized. He was christened at midnight by torchlight, the royal symbolism practically staging itself. He grew up in castles, but his upbringing was famously loveless, disciplinary, severe, ceremonial. He and his brother Otto, yes, that Otto, were raised more like living symbols than children. Ludwig later said that he could count the moments of true joy in his youth on one hand, From an early age, he retreated, not physically, but mentally into books, legends, art, operas, architecture. He adored the medieval romances of Lohengrin and Parsifal, obsessed over Germanic mythology, and developed an intense, lifelong admiration for Richard Wagner, the composer who would become both muse and burden. Ludwig's devotion to Wagner bordered on the devotional. He subsidized the man's debts, built him a theatre, and declared his music divine revelation. In return, Wagner called Ludwig the modern Parsifal a king too pure for politics. And perhaps he was. At 18, Ludwig inherited the Bavarian throne after the death of his father, Maximilian II. The people cheered. He was tall, strikingly handsome, intelligent, and eccentric in a way that still passed for charming. But Ludwig had no interest in the grinding mechanics of governance. Parliament, budgets, military alliances, these bored him. What thrilled him was fantasy. Escapism, control through curation. And so he began to build. In the decades that followed, Ludwig poured personal and state funds into a series of increasingly elaborate architectural projects, castles that looked like hallucinations, Neuschwanstein perched on cliffs, drenched in fog, practically allergic to utility, Linderhof, an ornate French-style palace with gold-encrusted peacocks and mirrored halls, Herrenchiemsee, a replica of Versailles, only lonelier. These were not mere buildings. They were kingdoms within kingdoms, governed by aesthetics, not law. Ludwig designed entire mythologies for these castles, filled them with secret passageways, trompe-l'oeil ceilings, and frescoes of saints he renamed as Wagnerian characters. He dined alone, at a table that could be lowered through the floor and raised again with meals, so he wouldn't have to see servants. He held mock banquets where no guests were invited. He gave himself titles like Protector of the Moon. He rode in sleds pulled by night-black horses under starlight, wearing elaborate medieval robes. The court grew nervous. By the late 1872, Ludwig's behavior had shifted from eccentric to unmanageable. He isolated himself entirely from court politics. He rarely appeared in Munich. He communicated with ministers through elaborate theatrical letters, often signed in Latin, sometimes sealed with wax imprinted with his own invented crest. He reportedly talked to portraits. He commissioned operas no one was allowed to perform. Ministers began to question not only his mental stability but his political viability. And then there were the expenses. His architectural ambitions had bankrupted his own coffers and Bavaria's. He borrowed heavily, sold family jewels, diverted state funds. He ignored parliamentary pleas to curb his spending. He reportedly said, "I want to remain an eternal enigma, to myself and to others." Mission accomplished. By 1886, a group of ministers, desperate to restore fiscal and political order, secretly commissioned a psychiatric evaluation of the king without ever speaking to him. The royal physician, Dr. Bernhard von Guden, and a panel of doctors declared Ludwig insane, citing paranoia and delusions of grandeur. It was enough. A plan was set in motion to depose him. On the 10th of June 1886, Ludwig was arrested at Neuschwanstein by a group of officials and taken to Berg Castle on the banks of Lake Starnberg. His own cousin, Prince Luitpold, was named regent. Ludwig was told he would no longer be king. He reportedly asked for a moment to collect himself. Then he went quietly. 2 days later, Ludwig was found dead in the shallow waters of the lake, alongside Dr. von Guden. The official report claimed drowning, with Guden dying in an attempt to save him. But the water was shallow, the circumstances murky, and the investigation almost comically insufficient. No autopsy, no inquiry, just silence and speculation. Did Ludwig kill himself? Did he try to flee and was killed in the process? Was it an accident? A murder? Historians still debate it. What's clear is that whatever happened, it was the final act of a tragedy in which beauty and madness became indistinguishable. In the years after his death, Ludwig's castles became tourist attractions. Neuschwanstein, the dream palace he never saw completed, inspired Disney's iconic fairy tale castle. The king who bankrupted his realm for fantasy was, in death, more profitable than he had ever been in life. He got what he wanted, in a way, to be remembered not as a politician, but as a myth. And yet, behind the chandeliers and marble facades was a man tormented not only by hallucinations or delusions, but by the unbearable tension of being too sensitive for power and too royal to escape it. A king who built kingdoms to avoid his own. But not every monarch had the luxury of withdrawing into fantasy. Some had to perform madness in real time on stages they couldn't control, surrounded by ministers who waited for them to fail. And in the case of one Danish king, they didn't have to wait long. Christian VII of Denmark and Norway, 1749-1808. There's a peculiar type of silence that lingers in royal courts, one filled not with absence, but with avoidance. The kind of silence where everyone knows something is wrong, but no one dares to name it aloud. In the late 18th century Danish court, that silence had a name: Christian VII. He became king at 17, too young, too fragile, and already too far gone. Christian VII was born into opulence and dysfunction, the son of King Frederick V of Denmark and his consort Louise of Great Britain. His early childhood was marked by extremes both of indulgence and neglect. After his mother's death, when he was just 3 years old, his upbringing became a case study in aristocratic detachment. Tutors came and went, discipline was erratic, and the young prince was, by most accounts, left emotionally and intellectually adrift. Descriptions of Christian as a child already hint at something unsettling. He was restless, prone to strange outbursts, easily distracted, and often cruel in the careless way that only unloved children can be. He tormented animals, mocked servants, and seemed incapable of sustained attention. Some modern historians believe these behaviors might point to neurological or developmental disorders. Others see them as early symptoms of a psychiatric condition that would later engulf his reign. What's clear is that by the time he became king in 1766, Christian was already cracking. He ascended the throne not with triumph, but with tremors. His early reign was a disaster in slow motion. He would fidget during council meetings, ignore important matters of state, and erupt into nervous laughter at inappropriate moments. He was prone to childish behavior, dancing wildly during formal ceremonies, making lewd jokes in the presence of diplomats, and once, allegedly, chasing courtiers with a fire poker. But these weren't just eccentricities, they were symptoms, patterns, warnings. The court did what courts often do. It improvised. Officials gently steered the king away from decision-making. Ministers learned to speak to him in soothing tones. The nobility hoped, perhaps prayed, that the young monarch would grow out of whatever strange affliction plagued him. He didn't. Instead, the court brought in a solution: marriage. Christian was wed to his cousin, Princess Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, in a political union that was meant to stabilize the throne and produce an heir. She was just 15, quiet, intelligent, and completely unprepared for what she was walking into. Their marriage was unsurprisingly a failure. Christian was erratic, emotionally unavailable, and increasingly unstable. He reportedly resented his wife's presence, often mocked her in public, and would disappear for days at a time, into strange, nocturnal wanderings. Still, they managed to produce a son, the future Frederick VI, and that, as far as the court was concerned, was success enough. But then came Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee was a German physician who entered Christian service in 1768 as his personal doctor. Educated, rational, and fluent in Enlightenment ideals, Struensee quickly became more than just a physician. He became a confidant, handler, and eventually de facto ruler. He was the one person who seemed able to calm Christian during his episodes. With the king's trust, Struensee began guiding state policy, issuing reforms and reshaping Danish governance from the shadows. And then, inevitably, from the centre. Between 1770 and 1772, Struensee effectively ruled Denmark. He abolished torture, reformed censorship laws, modernized healthcare, and enacted over 1,000 new regulations. It was a frenzy of Enlightenment-era reform done in the name of a king who could barely hold a conversation. Christian, now more isolated than ever, spent his days in distraction and disarray. His behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He would talk to himself in corners, pretend to conduct orchestras in empty rooms, and engage in compulsive rituals. Observers at court wrote of a man lost inside his own body. But no regime built on secrets lasts forever. Struensee, emboldened and careless, began a public affair with Queen Caroline Matilda. Whether out of love, power, or simply rebellion, the affair became a powder keg. In 1772, conservative nobles staged a palace coup. Struensee was arrested and executed. The queen was exiled. Christian? He remained king. Officially. In reality, he was now completely sidelined. A regency was established under his half-brother, Prince Frederick. Christian was confined, monitored, and paraded only when necessary. He lived another 36 years, largely forgotten by the machinery of state he nominally led. Reports from those years describe him as docile but confused, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost. A man suspended in time, like a puppet with tangled strings. He died in 1808, having outlived both his wife and the man who had tried to make sense of his reign. His legacy was not reform, nor revolution, nor tyranny. It was a question. What happens when power is placed in the hands of someone who cannot perceive it? Christian VII was not mad in the romanticized, operatic sense. His illness was mundane, tragic, and quietly terrifying. His reign was not marked by grand delusions, but by a slow erosion of presence, a king who became an absence in his own story. And yet, even an absent king casts a long shadow, especially when his illness becomes a blueprint for others. Because the quiet madness of Christian VII was not an isolated tragedy. It was a trend, a pattern rippling across Europe. And sometimes that ripple reached even the smallest of thrones like Lippe, a tiny principality where the crown sat too heavy on the head of one man who could never wear it alone. Prince Alexander of Lippe, 1831–1905. By the late 19th century, most of Europe's great monarchies had traded swords for ceremonies, replacing battlefield thrones with constitutional ones. But in Lippe, a minor German principality so small it was often mistaken for a county, the old ways lingered longer. It was a realm of pageantry without an audience, politics without urgency. And at its centre sat Prince Alexander, a man whose mind unravelled so quietly that the kingdom continued on, as if no one had noticed. Born in 1831 to the House of Lippe, Alexander was the second son of Leopold II, a regional ruler with modest ambitions. Lippe wasn't exactly the beating heart of European politics. It was more of a historical shrug. But within its narrow borders lay the full architecture of monarchy. A court, a flag, a line of succession, the usual tools of inherited rule, and the usual burdens. Alexander wasn't expected to reign. That duty belonged to his older brother Waldemar, who governed Lippe with relative stability until his death in 1895. But Waldemar had no children, no heirs, and so the crown passed to Alexander the Spare, who had been waiting in the wings for 64 years. There was just one problem. Alexander was mentally ill, and everyone already knew it. In fact, by the time he became prince, Alexander had been declared legally incompetent for decades. The diagnosis? Vague. The records are careful, clinical, and deliberately unhelpful. Some say he suffered from severe developmental issues. Others suggest late-onset psychosis or long-term schizophrenia. A few sources simply call it geistig Umnachtung, mental darkness, which, like many old-world diagnoses, says more about fear than fact. He had lived most of his adult life under constant supervision at a private estate in Detmold, isolated from public duties, shielded from scandal. He was the royal family's quiet secret, kept out of sight, out of newspapers, and out of conversation, until suddenly he wasn't. When Waldemar died, Lippe had no choice. According to the line of succession, Alexander was next. So, in 1895, a formal declaration was made. Prince Alexander of Lippe had ascended to the throne, and in the same breath, a regency was established. The move wasn't surprising. Lippe's government, small though it was, couldn't pretend Alexander was capable of ruling. But the question was, who would rule in his place? That simple issue spiraled into a full-blown crisis. Two branches of the family laid claim to the regency. The House of Schaumburg-Lippe, backed by the German Emperor Wilhelm II, and the House of Lippe-Biesterfeld, a lesser-known but stubborn line. Each side accused the other of opportunism, fraud, and overreach. And all the while, Prince Alexander sat in the background, untouched by the noise, reportedly unaware that his name had become the center of a dynastic civil war. The Lippe Regency dispute lasted nearly 5 years. 5 years of legal debates, political infighting, imperial intervention, and deeply awkward ceremonies where royal officials were forced to refer to a man who could not speak in public, sign a document, or even comprehend his role. What makes Alexander's story different from other mentally ill royals is that his incapacity wasn't hidden, it was institutionalized. It wasn't just whispered about in drawing rooms. It was debated in parliament, dissected in courtrooms, used as a legal chess piece. His illness became a constitutional loophole that other royals tried to crawl through. Everyone knew he couldn't rule. The real question was, who could rule through him? Eventually, in 1905, after Alexander's death, the Lippe-Biesterfeld line won. The regency ended. The principality, which had limped through a decade of political pantomime, tried to re-establish a sense of order, but it didn't last long. In just over a decade, World War I would dissolve monarchies across Europe, Lippe included. And what of Alexander? He remains a historical footnote, a monarch in title only, a man whose reign consisted of silence and ceremonial signatures written by others. He made no speeches, issued no proclamations, built no palaces, passed no laws. His existence as a ruler was a legal formality wrapped around a personal tragedy. But that's precisely what makes his story so revealing. Because Alexander's reign was a monarchy, stripped to its bare bones, an institution continuing to function without the person it was supposedly built around. a government ruled not by a man, but by the absence of one. It's one thing to have a mad king making decisions. It's another to have no king at all, just the outline of one, like a royal silhouette pressed into paper. And yet, even Alexander's silence cast echoes, because elsewhere in Europe, another prince had been born into a duchy that expected him to lead. He, too, would find himself replaced by regents. He, too, would be quietly removed from power. But unlike Alexander, this next royal was never officially declared mad, just too dangerous to be trusted with his own territory. And by the time they took it away from him, his mind had already turned against itself. Magnus, Duke of Ostergotland, 1542-1595. Sweden has always had a complicated relationship with silence. Long winters, long shadows, and longer dynasties. And tucked deep within its royal archives lies the story of a man who reigned not with power, but with absence, a duke whose title meant responsibility, whose mind meant ruin, and whose name, by the end, was more whispered than spoken. Magnus Vasa, Duke of Ostergotland, was born in 1542 into the ruling house of Vasa, one of the most influential royal dynasties in Scandinavian history. His father, King Gustav I, was no gentle patriarch. He was a hard-edged reformer who ripped Sweden away from Catholicism and restructured its monarchy like a fortress, one son at the throne, the others distributed like military posts across the realm. And so Magnus, the fourth surviving son, was granted Ostergotland, a duchy of lakes, forests, and loyal tax collectors. It was an honorable gift. It was also a trap. Unlike his more politically aggressive brothers, particularly the future kings Eric XIV and John III, Magnus was not groomed for conquest. He was quieter, more introspective. Reports from his youth describe a boy who was intelligent, deeply religious, prone to solitude. A boy who would wander the halls of Vadstena Castle speaking to himself. Sensitive, they said. Fragile, others muttered. But in a world where male sensitivity was either ignored or punished, no one really knew what to do with him. He assumed control of Ostergotland in 1555 at the age of 13. Of course, at first, he ruled through advisors. But by his 20s, he had established his own court, his own treasury, and his own governance. He minted coins with his face, issued decrees, reviewed petitions. By all appearances, Magnus was doing what was expected. Then, around 1563, something changed. The records grow vague here, as they always do when royalty begins to deviate from the script. But signs of distress emerge. Magnus began refusing meetings. He neglected state matters. His letters became rambling, erratic, often religious in tone. He was seen pacing alone in the courtyards of his estate, speaking out loud in Latin prayers, sometimes issuing commands to no one in particular. His servants reported mood swings, prolonged silences, sudden bursts of speech that veered between brilliance and confusion. At first, the court called it melancholia, a term used loosely to describe anything from depression to what we'd now call psychosis. But as years passed, it became clear that Magnus wasn't experiencing a passing illness. He was unraveling. By the late 1562, his episodes had grown more severe. He believed he was being followed by demons. He reportedly claimed to receive messages from angels, often contradictory, always urgent. He accused members of his household of betrayal, only to later forget the accusations entirely. And still, he remained Duke of Ostergotland, because removing him would have meant admitting something worse, that the Vasa bloodline was not invincible. Eventually, his duties were quietly stripped away. His lands were administered by stewards. His decisions were reviewed and, when necessary, rewritten. But he remained in title, and more importantly, in isolation. Unlike other royals whose madness ignited political coups or scandals, Magnus was simply moved aside, not deposed, not imprisoned, just placed at the edge of things, as though his illness might fade if ignored long enough. He spent the last decades of his life at Vadstena Castle, which became less a home and more a gilded oubliette. Visitors were rare, letters even rarer. From time to time, Magnus was seen walking the castle halls at night, mumbling scripture or holding full conversations with empty chairs. His physical health declined, and his mental world shrank to the size of a corridor. And then came the flood. In 1577, Vadstena Castle was hit by a sudden surge of water from the nearby lake. The floodwaters reportedly broke into Magnus's chambers in the middle of the night. Some say he believed it was a biblical punishment. Others say he was asleep. Whatever the truth, the damage was done. After the flood, Magnus was never the same again, physically weakened, mentally unmoored. Even his quiet routines began to deteriorate. He died in 1595 at the age of 52. There was no grand funeral, no national mourning, no royal proclamation. His death was noted in the records, accompanied by a dry line. Magnus, Duke of Ostergotland, passed away peacefully. The peace, of course, was relative. And what's left of him today? A few coins, a few letters, some passing mentions in dusty genealogies, but more than anything, a template. The noble born into leadership whose mind betrayed him. The brother who didn't fit. The ruler whose rule was slowly systematically absorbed by others. Yet Magnus was not the only Vasa to descend into illness. His older brother, Eric XIV, would follow a darker and more violent path, unraveling in full public view. If Magnus represented the quiet madness of seclusion, Eric would represent its theatrical, terrifying opposite. Because where Magnus withdrew, Eric exploded. Eric XIV of Sweden, 1533-1577. If Magnus was the whisper, Eric of 14 was the scream. Where one Vasa brother withered into silence, the other carved his madness into history with ink, fire, and blood-red wax. Eric was not a man ignored. He was a king, watched, feared, and finally locked away by his own council, in a tower built for someone just like him. Born in 1533, Eric was the firstborn son of Gustav Vasa, the architect of modern Sweden, and a monarch who treated kingship less like a divine right and more like a family business. From the start, Eric was groomed to inherit not just a throne but a national myth. His education was rigorous and humanist Latin, history, astronomy, diplomacy. He was fluent in 5 languages before he turned 20 and wrote treatises on everything from governance to astrology. Sharp, ambitious, cultured, and already unstable. Contemporaries noted that Eric was prone to mood swings even as a teenager. One court official described him as brilliant but restless, and noted his tendency towards suspicion. He would withdraw for days, emerge full of fire and schemes, and then collapse into gloom without warning. Still, nothing so severe that it raised alarms, at least not yet. In 1560, when Gustav died, Eric became king, and at first, things looked promising. He styled himself a Renaissance monarch, issuing reforms, expanding foreign alliances, and commissioning portraits that made him look like the very picture of Nordic nobility. But behind the regal facade, something darker was beginning to stir. Eric was obsessed with legitimacy, not just legally, but existentially. Though he had inherited the crown, He seemed perpetually paranoid that someone might try to take it back. He distrusted the nobility, the clergy, his own brothers. He surrounded himself with spies and informants, issued secret decrees, and monitored court conversations with something approaching compulsion. And then there were the women. Eric had a romantic imagination and a deeply unsteady emotional world. He fell in love easily and obsessively, sometimes with noble women, sometimes with peasants, always with intensity. He was fixated on the idea of a perfect queen. He proposed marriage to Elizabeth I of England. She declined politely. Then to Mary, Queen of Scots, she declined, less politely. Finally, he married a commoner, Karin Mon's daughter, a love match that scandalized the court and inflamed his paranoia. His nobles didn't approve, which meant, in Eric's mind, they were plotting against him. By 1567, his paranoia had metastasized. He became convinced that members of the noble Stuart family were conspiring to overthrow him. There was no credible evidence. But Eric didn't need evidence, just intuition, fueled by sleepless nights and whispered anxieties. And then came what history now calls the Stuart murders. Eric summoned several members of the Stuart family to Uppsala Castle. There, in a bizarre series of events still debated by historians, he personally participated in, or ordered their execution, despite some of them being his own guests, held without trial. In one account, Eric entered the prison chambers himself, sword in hand, and struck one of the Stuarts down. In another, he stood over their corpses afterward, sobbing, repeating, "What have I done?" for hours. Whether he committed the killings with his own hands or merely gave the order, the message was clear. Eric's mind was no longer a private affliction. It had become a political threat. After the Stuart murders, Eric's behavior deteriorated rapidly. He stopped attending council meetings. He began wearing strange costumes. He refused to bathe. He saw omens in the stars, curses in the wind, treachery in every side glance. Some days he spoke in riddles. Other days he locked himself in his chamber and refused to speak at all. And then, inexplicably, came moments of clarity. He would apologize. He would issue rational orders. He would kiss his infant daughter's forehead with trembling tenderness. But no one trusted it anymore, least of all his half-brothers, John and Charles, who were already making preparations for what would come next. In 1568, the nobility finally acted. John, with support from the aristocracy and foreign allies, staged a coup. Eric was arrested, deposed, and imprisoned. His wife and children were sent away. The throne passed to John III, who ruled with a deliberate, cautious hand, as if trying to unwrite his brother's legacy. Eric, meanwhile, was shuttled between castles for nearly a decade: Kalmar, Urbyhus, Gripsholm. At times, he was treated well, at others, kept under heavy guard. Throughout it all, his mental state continued its unpredictable pattern, stretches of lucidity interrupted by rants, obsessions, and total withdrawal. He wrote obsessive letters to his wife, detailed treatises on astrology, and paranoid accounts of imaginary plots against him. In 1577, Eric died under suspicious circumstances. Poison was suspected, but never proven. The official cause was dysentery. The unofficial story passed from chronicler to chronicler was that the new regime had quietly ended what they could no longer contain. His legacy is split down the middle. To some, Eric XIV was a tragic genius, undone by his own brilliance and sensitivity in a court that had no room for it. To others, he was a paranoid tyrant, ruled by delusion and terror. But perhaps the truth sits somewhere in between, a man who understood the crushing weight of a crown too well, and who tried to carry it anyway, even as his own mind worked against him. And while Eric's fall was dramatic, almost Shakespearean in scope, he was not the last Swedish royal to find himself at war with his own mind. A century later, another noble would follow a path of quiet collapse, one with fewer bloodstains, perhaps, but no fewer questions. A prince born into privilege, marked by melancholy, and slowly erased from power not by scandal, but by silence. Maria of Portugal's sisters, Maria Anna Francisca and Maria Dorothea. Royal courts love a spectacle, but they fear a pattern. And when madness runs not through one monarch, but through an entire bloodline, sisters, brothers, aunts, and heirs, the whispers become harder to contain, the shadows lengthen. The portrait gallery begins to feel like a lineage of ghosts. So when Queen Maria I of Portugal began to lose her grip on reality in the late 18th century, the court was troubled. But when her sisters, Maria Anna Francisca and Maria Dorothea, also began showing signs of mental and emotional instability, the court wasn't just troubled, it was terrified. Because it wasn't just one queen unraveling, it was a dynasty, quietly deteriorating from within. Maria, as we've already seen, became increasingly overwhelmed by depression, hallucinations, and religious delusions following the deaths of her husband and children. Her decline was dramatic, public, and eventually institutionalized. But her sisters, often overlooked in history books, followed similar and in some ways eerier paths. Their breakdowns were not shouted from palace rooftops or debated in parliament. They were whispered about in antechambers, managed behind locked doors, and excised from official portraits. Let's start with Maria Anna Francisca, the younger sister born in 1736. From her earliest years, she was considered quiet, sensitive, and overly pious, a phrase used by court observers as code for compulsive behavior. She prayed constantly. She fasted to unhealthy extremes. She refused to eat unless food was blessed 3 times by different priests. One physician noted that she had mystical tendencies bordering on delusion. But in a court as religious as the Braganzas, those kinds of behaviors were more tolerated than diagnosed. Still, the signs were there. She withdrew from social events, claimed to have visions, and insisted on sleeping in a stone cell rather than her royal bedroom. Servants recorded strange episodes. Hours spent muttering Latin phrases under her breath. Refusal to acknowledge people she had known for years, sudden sobbing fits. At one point, she demanded that all mirrors be removed from her chambers, claiming they reflected not her image but the devil's eyes. The royal physicians tried the usual prescriptions: prayer, pilgrimage, and silence. What they couldn't do, what they wouldn't dare, was admit that the Queen's sister might be suffering from the same hereditary affliction that was beginning to consume Maria I herself. Maria Anna was never officially declared insane, but she was quietly removed from public life by her late 20s. She lived most of her adult years in semi-seclusion within royal estates, rarely appearing at state functions and never taking a political role. Her condition fluctuated, some months lucid, some lost to long periods of emotional paralysis. By the time her sister Maria was formally declared unfit to rule in 1792, Maria Anna had already faded from the public imagination. She died in 1813, just 3 years before Maria I, as forgotten as she had lived. But the pattern didn't end there. Maria Dorothea, born in 1739, was the youngest of the Braganza sisters and arguably the most enigmatic. While less is known about her than her elder siblings, what survives is oddly consistent. The same slow withdrawal, the same intense religiosity, the same reports of unpredictable behavior. As a teenager, Dorothea was considered vivacious and charming. Suitors were interested. Alliances were proposed. But all of them fell through, some say because of politics, others because of whispers about her mental health. What we do know is that by her 30s, Dorothea had become increasingly reclusive. She insisted on being accompanied by nuns rather than ladies in waiting. She refused to leave her private chapel for days at a time. She once accused her own confessor of being a demon in disguise. Reports from the palace suggest long periods of catatonia, punctuated by bursts of ecstatic speech, usually about sin, judgment, and redemption. Like her sister Maria Anna, she was never formally institutionalized. But also like Maria Anna, she was removed from public view, her name rarely appearing in court documents after 1770. She died in 1771, still young, still unmarried, and by all accounts, deeply tormented. Historians now look back on these three sisters and see not coincidence, but legacy. The Braganza family was deeply inbred, like many royal houses of Europe. Marriages between uncles and nieces, first cousins, and double cousins were common. The result was a genetic bottleneck, one that may have amplified underlying vulnerabilities to mental illness. But what makes the case of Maria's sisters so haunting is how deliberately they were erased from the narrative. No scandals, no rebellions, no formal diagnoses. Just a quiet disintegration, managed behind draped windows and heavy doors. Their suffering was not denied, it was simply ignored. Because if one queen goes mad, it's a tragedy. If her sisters follow, it's a bloodline problem. And monarchies, more than anything, are built on the illusion of permanence. The idea that the crown can be passed like a torch, unflickering, undamaged, eternal. But in Portugal, the torch was already sputtering. And while the Braganzas struggled to contain their lineage's private demons elsewhere in the world, an emperor was turning his madness into theatre. A ruler whose legend eclipsed even his crimes. A man so far removed from reality that historians still can't agree whether he was insane or simply what happens when too much power meets no resistance. The name Caligula. Caligula, Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, 1-2-41 CE. There are few names in history that carry the weight of rumor quite like Caligula, a name that evokes excess, sadism, and a particularly Roman brand of madness, imperial theatrical, God-touched. And yet, for a man so infamous, the line between fact and fiction remains blurred like frescoes in candlelight. Born in 12 CE as Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he would later be known by the childhood nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, a nod to the miniature soldier's uniform he wore while following his father on military campaigns. At the time, it was an affectionate gesture. Later, it would feel ironic, even cruel, because if there's one thing the empire learned, it was that nothing about Caligula was little. He ascended to the throne at 24, the first emperor born into the imperial family line. His father, Germanicus, was a beloved general. His great-uncle, Augustus, had crafted the very concept of Roman emperorship. Caligula was, on paper, a golden heir. And for the first few months of his reign, he played the part well. He pardoned political prisoners. He reversed unpopular taxes. He gave generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the military force that had helped install him. Rome cheered. Statues were raised. Coins were minted. Temples were cleaned in anticipation of a new golden age. And then something shifted. In October of 37 CE, less than a year into his reign, Caligula fell violently ill. The nature of the illness is unknown. Ancient sources are vague and sensational. Fever, seizures, hallucinations. Some say it was poisoning. Others suggest epilepsy or encephalitis. But what matters is what happened after he recovered. Because the man who emerged was not the man they had crowned. He became increasingly erratic, publicly aggressive, obsessive with ceremony, and insulted by imagined slights. He began declaring himself divine not in the poetic, abstract sense Roman emperors were known for, but quite literally. He insisted on being worshipped as a living god, ordered his statue to be placed in temples, demanded sacrifices in his name. Senators were instructed to address him as Jupiter. He married, divorced, and remarried multiple times within months. Banquets were turned into hours-long performances where guests were forced to watch in silence as he monologued about his genius. He reportedly wept during plays not because they were tragic, but because the actors were not worshipping him properly. He talked to the moon. He built bridges that led nowhere. He appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a priest, possibly even a senator, though that detail may be poetic exaggeration. Ancient sources can't agree if this act was a sign of derangement or mockery. Maybe it was both. Modern historians debate how much of this is true and how much is posthumous slander. Ancient Roman historians, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, were not known for their restraint. Many of the more lurid details come from them bedroom scandals, cruelty, sacrilege. But even if only a fraction of it is accurate, the portrait is clear. Caligula became untethered from reality. And once untethered, he began to treat the empire not as a responsibility, but as a performance, a stage, a theatre in which he played every role. What's most unsettling is how institutional Rome responded. The Senate grumbled but obeyed. The army watched but waited. The people gossiped but continued their daily rituals. Rome, in other words, functioned. Even as its emperor demanded divinity and raved at the stars, even as the boundaries between governance and delusion vanished. The facade didn't last forever. In 41 CE, after 4 years of chaos, a group of Praetorian guards assassinated Caligula in a palace hallway. The plot had been brewing for months. He was stabbed dozens of times and left to die in the arms of the very court that once worshipped him. His wife and child were killed as well, part of the brutal Roman logic of purging a bloodline. The Senate, briefly emboldened, attempted to restore the Republic, but within hours the guards had proclaimed a new emperor, Caligula's uncle, Claudius. The machinery of empire snapped back into place. And Caligula? His memory was officially condemned, his statues destroyed, his name erased from inscriptions. Damnatio memoriae, a bureaucratic form of forgetting. But madness, true or manufactured, leaves stains deeper than marble. And the question lingered. Was Caligula mad, or simply the most honest emperor Rome ever had? One who treated the empire exactly as it was violent, hypocritical, and absurd? The answer didn't matter. The precedent did. Because if Rome could survive a mad emperor, it could survive anything. Or so they thought, until his successor took the stage. Nero, 3768 CE. If Caligula was the warm-up act, Nero was the opera. Grand, dissonant, destructive, and convinced that every note he sang was divine. Where Caligula's madness was sudden and theatrical, Nero's was a slow crescendo, drawn out over 14 years and set to the music of a kingdom learning, painfully, how much one man's delusion could cost. Born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, Nero was adopted at the age of 3 by by the Emperor Claudius, his great-uncle and later named heir, displacing Claudius's own son. The adoption was not sentimental. It was political, orchestrated by Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, one of Rome's most ambitious and calculating women. And it worked. At age 16, Nero became emperor. Young, attractive, and at first largely silent. For the first few years of his reign, governance was handled by a coalition. Agrippina, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. Together, they kept Nero out of trouble and the empire afloat. But then Nero began to grow into his role and out of theirs. He wanted to perform, literally. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, an actor. He took the stage in public theatres, scandalizing the Roman elite who still clung to the fiction that emperors were above performance. Nero disagreed. He believed the emperor was the performance. His early reign saw reforms and populist policies. He reduced taxes, banned capital punishment, and supported the arts. But behind the curtain, things were curdling. His paranoia grew. His appetite for control widened. He grew suspicious of his mother's influence and had her removed from court, then exiled, then, finally, killed. Suetonius claims she was stabbed to death in her villa after surviving a failed attempt to sink her ship. From there, Nero's spiral continued. His advisors fell out of favor. Seneca was forced to commit suicide. Political opponents disappeared. He married multiple times, often under bizarre circumstances, and reportedly began performing in women's clothing, insisting on being addressed as various gods. But the most famous moment of Nero's reign came in 64 CE, the Great Fire of Rome. The blaze raged for days, consuming large parts of the city. Rumors swirled that Nero had started the fire himself, either to clear space for a new palace or simply to watch the spectacle. Some sources claim he played the lyre and sang while the city burned. Others say he was out of town and returned to aid in the recovery. The truth is hazy, but the damage to his reputation was immediate. To deflect blame, Nero accused a small, suspicious new sect of religious outcasts, the Christians. What followed was one of the first state-sponsored persecutions of Christians in Roman history, mass arrests, executions, and the beginning of a long, bloody precedent. In his final years, Nero descended into full theatrical tyranny. He spent lavishly on festivals, forced senators to applaud his performances, and built a massive palace, the Domus Aurea, on the ruins of the fire. His artistic ambitions consumed his political ones. Rome was no longer being governed. It was being directed. Eventually, the empire pushed back. Revolts broke out. Generals refused orders. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Faced with execution, he fled Rome. According to legend, his final words were, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30. The line between artist and emperor, between performer and madman, had finally collapsed. But Nero's reign wasn't just the end of a dynasty. It was the beginning of a question that would haunt rulers for centuries. When a man wears both a crown and a mask, how do you know which is which? And in the next emperor, the mask became even harder to remove, because what came after Nero wasn't peace. It was reflection. Cruel, paranoid reflection. Just ask the man who succeeded him and then slowly turned into him. Commodus, 161, 192 CE. If Nero set the stage for the emperor as performer, Commodus turned the whole empire into a colosseum and made himself both the main act and the executioner. He was the son of Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most philosophically revered emperor in Roman history. Marcus spent his reign meditating on virtue and duty while waging endless wars against the empire's enemies. His Stoic writings would later become global bestsellers for people trying to survive boardrooms and bad relationships. But behind the meditations and military discipline, Marcus made a critical mistake. He chose his son to succeed him. Commodus wasn't like his father. He wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even particularly interested in administration. What he was interested in passionately was glory. But not the old Roman kind, won through statesmanship or conquest. Commodus wanted a different kind of immortality, the kind that came with statues, chanting crowds, and theatrical costumes. In short, he wanted to be a god. And the gods, conveniently, never needed to explain themselves. He became co-emperor with his father at the age of 15 and sole emperor at 19, after Marcus's death in 180 CE. Initially, things looked stable enough. Commodus handed off most administrative duties to a group of trusted advisors. The Senate sighed in relief. Rome kept functioning. But Commodus wasn't content with being emperor in name. He wanted to be seen. He had himself portrayed as Hercules, the demigod hero, in paintings, sculpture, even on coinage clad in lion skins and wielding a club. This wasn't symbolic. Commodus insisted it was literal. He believed himself to be the earthly incarnation of Hercules, a man-god born to remake Rome in his own image. His obsession with public performance escalated quickly. He fought in gladiatorial games not as a symbolic gesture, but in staged matches at the Colosseum. At first, his opponents were restrained or disarmed. Then, he began executing wounded soldiers, amputees, even animals often while wearing theatrical armor, and announcing himself as conqueror of 1,000 gladiators. Rome was not amused. The aristocracy recoiled. The Senate muttered, but the crowds? They cheered. Bread and circuses were working, at least in the short term. Commodus began renaming months after his own titles, including Lucius, Amazonius, and Exuperatorius. He renamed Rome itself, Colonia Commodiana. Even the legions were forced to adopt titles that paid tribute to him. In effect, he tried to rewrite reality using imperial bureaucracy. Behind the pageantry, the imperial court grew dangerous. Commodus surrounded himself with flatterers and executioners. Anyone who questioned his divinity or even his fashion choices risked exile, imprisonment, or death. He cycled through advisors with alarming speed, often turning against them after brief periods of favor. His paranoia was not strategic, it was compulsive. Eventually, the conspiracies became real. In 192 CE, after surviving multiple assassination attempts, Commodus's inner circle decided to act. His mistress, Marcia, and members of the Praetorian Guard poisoned him. When the poison failed, they strangled him in his bath. The Senate declared him a tyrant and tried to erase his legacy. Damnatio memoriae again. But Commodus left behind something more stubborn than statues: the normalization of imperial delusion. Because when a ruler claims divinity and the system bends to accommodate it, something fundamental changes not just in governance, but in the collective psyche. Commodus didn't just go mad. He built an empire that made madness the job description. And the empire, like a battered actor, kept performing. Even after his death, the rot he helped spread lingered. Rome would never quite be the same. The emperors who followed either tried to outdo his madness or erase its memory. But erasure rarely works, especially when the next emperor learned all too well how power corrodes, quietly. Because after Commodus came a man who started his reign in shadow and dragged the entire court in with him. Tiberius 42 BCE 37 CE. Yes, the timeline jumps backward. History is not always a straight line. Sometimes it circles back to remind us the roots of imperial instability run deep. Before Nero, before Caligula, before Commodus, there was Tiberius. Tiberius was Rome's second emperor, the reluctant successor to Augustus, the founder of the imperial system, the man who turned republic into monarchy without using either word. And Tiberius, his stepson, was supposed to preserve the illusion. But Tiberius never wanted the role. He was born into privilege, yes, but also into a family of political entanglements. His mother, Livia Drusilla, married Augustus after divorcing Tiberius's father. Augustus then adopted Tiberius formally, making him heir. But the adoption came with conditions. Tiberius had to divorce the woman he loved, Vipsania, Agrippina, and marry Julia, Augustus's volatile daughter. He obeyed, of course. That's what heirs do. But something in him broke. Tiberius was not a populist or a showman. He hated public appearances. He spoke rarely, smiled less. He had military credentials. He served ably in Germany and Illyria, but he was cold, calculating, and famously private. When Augustus died in 14 CE, Tiberius ascended to power not with triumph, but with a kind of muttered resignation. At first, he ruled conservatively. He respected Senate traditions. He preserved the institutions Augustus had put in place. But beneath the surface, paranoia was growing. Tiberius trusted no one. He relied heavily on a man named Sejanus, head of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus became the real power behind the throne, orchestrating purges, trials, and secret executions. Informants multiplied. Political trials became common. Rome was entering the era of suspicion. Then, in 26 CE, Tiberius did something no emperor had done before. He left. He withdrew from Rome entirely, moving to the island of Capri, where he lived in isolation for the last decade of his reign. The court followed him in fragments. Messages were relayed by intermediaries. Decisions were signed but rarely explained. Capri became a metaphor, a floating palace of withdrawal, where the emperor ruled by decree but remained unseen. Rumors flourished, of strange rituals, of cruelty, of madness. Ancient historians, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, portray this period as grotesque and perverse. But again, the truth is hard to untangle. What's clear is that Tiberius, like so many emperors after him, slowly transformed from administrator to spectre. When he died in 37 CE, the Senate did not weep. His successor, the young and theatrical Caligula, would quickly reverse course, restoring public games and performances to mask the paranoia he would later inherit. But Tiberius left behind a warning that even a cautious emperor, one who hated power and preferred isolation, could still sow the seeds of systemic instability. Not through flamboyant madness, but through silent fear. And sometimes, silence is worse, because it allows the empire to continue as if nothing is wrong, as if the man at the center is still fully present, as if the darkness gathering in the corners of the court is just shadow, and not the beginning of collapse. But collapse always starts slowly, with whispers, with rumors, with rulers who withdraw until suddenly the throne is speaking only to itself. Antoninus Elagabalus, 203–222 CE. The Roman Empire was already unraveling when Elagabalus arrived. He didn't pull the thread, he just dyed it purple, crowned it with gold, and danced it through the streets until the fabric came undone. Born in 203 CE in Emesa, Syria, Elagabalus was a high priest before he was a prince worshipping the sun god Elagabal, a local deity centered on a black conical stone believed to have fallen from the sky. His original name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but history would remember him by the name of his god. Not coincidentally, he thought they were one and the same. He was only 14 when he became emperor, placed on the throne by the political ambition of his grandmother, Julia Maesa, sister-in-law to the late Emperor Septimius Severus and an expert in dynastic opportunism. After the death of her other grandson, Caracalla, another study in imperial volatility, Maesa promoted Elagabalus as the rightful heir, claiming he was the secret son of Caracalla. The legions, ever susceptible to a good story and a bonus payment, agreed. So did the Senate, reluctantly. What followed was one of the most disorienting reigns in Roman history. Not because Elagabalus was militarily disastrous, he barely waged war, nor because he was politically tyrannical. He was too young for tyranny in the traditional sense. No, his reign disturbed Rome because it blurred every line Rome had ever drawn between emperor and subject, religion and politics, identity and order. Elagabalus brought his god with him. Literally. He had the black stone of Elagabal shipped to Rome and installed in a lavish new temple, the Elagabalium. Then he declared the deity supreme over Jupiter, Mars, and the entire Roman pantheon. Traditionalist Romans were horrified. The emperor paraded through the streets with the sacred stone in a chariot, dressed in gold robes, sprinkling incense, chanting in Syriac. He forced senators and priests to participate in the ceremonies, treating the Roman gods as mere supporting actors in his divine play. But religion was only part of the spectacle. Elagabalus delighted in confusion of gender, of hierarchy, of identity. He wore elaborate makeup, extravagant costumes, and insisted on being referred to in feminine terms. He is now considered by some modern scholars to be one of the first historical figures who might be described as transgender or gender non-conforming. He reportedly expressed a desire for surgery that would have been seen as radical even by modern standards, though, again, ancient sources are tangled with bias, mockery, and political venom. He married multiple times, both men and women, but none of it was about alliance building or dynastic continuity. It was performance, spectacle, disruption. His palace became a theatre of reversals. Slaves dined like nobles, soldiers served as entertainers, religious rites blurred with erotic displays. Elagabalus didn't rule the empire, he hosted it. Unsurprisingly, the court and military elites grew nervous, and Rome, an empire already reeling from economic strain and political instability, was in no mood for theatrical experiments. In 222 CE, after just 4 years on the throne, Elagabalus was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard alongside his mother. Their bodies were mutilated, thrown into the Tiber. The Senate, as usual, attempted a damnatio memoriae, erasing his name from inscriptions and statues. His cousin Severus Alexander was installed in his place, a boy emperor with handlers ready to keep the next experiment from getting out of hand. But erasure didn't work. Elagabalus became legend. Not just for his rituals or fashions or politics, but because he represented something deeply threatening to imperial Rome, a ruler who refused to play by the rules of power, who unmade identity as casually as others signed decrees, who believed the emperor wasn't bound by Rome's past, but by his own reinvention. And in that sense, Elagabalus wasn't just mad, he was prophetic. A preview of how fragile the imperial illusion really was. Because sometimes insanity isn't a break from reality, it's a mirror held too close to the face of empire. And in that mirror, Rome kept seeing reflections it didn't like. The next reflection came in the form of a ruler whose madness was less flamboyant but just as politically dangerous. A man with a temper like a knife's edge and a face half buried in his own past. A ruler Rome exiled from memory, even after he clawed his way back to the throne. Justinian II, 669, 711 CE. By the time Justinian II took the Byzantine throne, the empire had learned to fear silence more than war. Emperors were expected to speak carefully, rule strategically, and above all hold on to power with a combination of calculation and restraint. Justinian had neither. He ruled in sharp angles. Born in 669 CE, Justinian II was the son of Constantine IV and part of the Heraclian dynasty, which had already weathered religious controversies, external invasions, and internal backstabbing. Justinian ascended to the throne at 16. He was intelligent, confident, and deeply religious traits that, in isolation, would have served him well. Combined, they made him dangerous. His first reign, from 685 to 695, began with promise. He was ambitious about tax reform, religious unification, and expanding imperial control. He launched successful campaigns against Slavs and Arabs, strengthened the eastern frontier, and tried to reorganize imperial finances. But there was a problem. Justinian's ambition quickly metastasized into ruthlessness. He taxed harshly, punished enemies without hesitation, displayed an increasingly autocratic streak. Even his religious policies intended to unify the church ended up alienating both sides. He saw dissent not as disagreement but as betrayal. And in Byzantium, betrayal has always been a group sport. In 695, his enemies made their move. A revolt led by the military commander Leontios deposed Justinian. He was seized, mutilated, his nose was cut off, a Byzantine practice designed to permanently disqualify someone from imperial office and exile to Cherson in the Crimea. From then on, he would be known as Justinian Rhinotmetos or Justinian the Slit-Nosed. He should have disappeared from history right there. But Justinian wasn't interested in disappearing. During his exile, he plotted. He rebuilt alliances, married the daughter of a Khazar Khan, escaped captivity, raised an army. In 705, 10 years after being maimed and thrown out, he marched back into Constantinople at the head of a foreign force and retook the throne. It was one of the most dramatic comebacks in imperial history. And then it got worse. His second reign was marked by a terrifying blend of vengeance and paranoia. He hunted down those who had betrayed him, tortured former officials, executed political opponents. His policies became more erratic, his punishments more theatrical. One chronicler said, "He returned as a wolf, not a man." He built churches, made peace treaties, hosted elaborate ceremonies, and behind it all, purged and punished, and screamed into the corridors of power. By 711, the empire had had enough. Another revolt, another betrayal. Justinian was killed while fleeing the capital, his head presented to the new emperor as proof that the era of instability was momentarily over. But Justinian's madness didn't lie in hallucinations or delusions. His madness was procedural, calculated, punishing, the madness of a man who believed pain could repair legacy. And maybe that's the most dangerous kind. Because emperors like Justinian remind us that sometimes madness isn't a break from power. It is power pushed past its limits, stripped of its courtiers, and forced to speak its true name. And that name, obsessive, volatile, vengeful, echoed far beyond Byzantium. All the way across the world, in a dynasty built on Confucian ideals and strict hierarchies, a prince would rise who wore a different kind of madness, one soaked in filial trauma, moral collapse, and royal fear. A prince whose mind turned not on delusions of grandeur, but on the unbearable weight of being watched. Crown Prince Sado, 1735-1762. In the halls of Korea's royal palace, the tragedy of Crown Prince Sado echoes like a cautionary parable spoken softly, never officially forgotten, but rarely spoken of directly. It is the kind of story that monarchy doesn't know how to process. Not a tale of failed conquest, not a betrayal or a coup, but the slow, painful deterioration of a mind under the crushing weight of ritual, filial expectation, and absolute control. Born in 1735 as the second son of King Yongzhou of the Joseon dynasty, Yi Seon, later known as Prince Sado, was not initially destined to rule. But after his older brother died in infancy, the role of heir was thrust upon him before he could understand what it meant. And in a dynasty that prized order, propriety, and Confucian virtue above all else, understanding was not optional, it was mandatory, lifelong, and fatal when incomplete. From the outside, Sado's early life followed the prescribed pattern: rigorous education, relentless supervision, and staged displays of filial piety. But cracks appeared early. Court records describe the young prince as anxious, sensitive, and prone to violent outbursts. He was terrified of thunderstorms, refused to be alone at night, and began to exhibit signs of obsessive behavior. Some believed he was spoiled. Others suspected something deeper, an internal fracture the court didn't know how to name. But the court didn't need a diagnosis. It needed a prince. And his father, King Yongzhou, was the embodiment of Confucian authority. Intelligent, long-lived, and exacting, he saw in Sado not a son, but a vessel, a future king to be molded, corrected, and, if necessary, broken. Their relationship was a performance of failure. Every mistake Sado made, no matter how small, was met with stern lectures, public shaming, and deliberate emotional distance. The king often wrote disparagingly of his son in official records, documenting each lapse of etiquette, each outburst, as though chronicling a slow-motion disaster. And Sado, desperate for approval, spiraled further. His symptoms worsened with age. He developed mood swings, severe anxiety, and fits of rage. He reported being haunted by visions. He changed clothes dozens of times a day, refused to bathe for weeks, and, at his worst, wandered the palace halls muttering to himself, and refusing to eat food unless it was specially prepared. Servants and ladies in waiting grew fearful, and eventually terrified. There are stories, some contested, others accepted, of his acts of cruelty, his erratic punishments, his descent into unpredictable violence. But what's more haunting than any individual act is the slow institutional response to it. No doctor was summoned, no treatment offered. Because in the Joseon court, mental illness didn't exist. Only moral weakness did. And moral weakness in a prince was not an affliction, it was treason. In 1762, the situation reached its breaking point. After years of increasingly erratic behavior and mounting fear among the court, King Yongzhou was confronted with a dilemma that monarchs across history have quietly faced. What do you do when your heir becomes a threat? In a chilling solution wrapped in ceremonial logic, the king issued an indirect death sentence. He ordered his son confined, not beheaded or exiled, but locked inside a rice chest, a wooden box used to store grain. No trial, no public declaration, just silence, sealed in wood. Sado remained inside the chest for 8 days. When it was finally opened, he was dead. The court documented the event with cold precision. The king declared it an act of national protection. Officials rewrote the narrative to protect the royal dignity. Sado had been unwell, but the decision was regrettable. No one mentioned illness, no one mentioned fear, only failure. Sado's name was struck from official succession, but his son, the future King Jeongjo, was eventually elevated to the throne, an act of royal reconciliation and historical amnesia. But the scars remained. Even centuries later, historians debate whether Sado suffered from bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or complex trauma rooted in relentless emotional abuse. The truth is buried beneath layers of dynasty and denial. What's undeniable is that his mind collapsed under conditions no person, much less a child groomed for power, could survive. Crown Prince Sado's life was not ended by madness. It was created, shaped, and destroyed by a system that demanded perfection and offered no exit. In the end, he became both victim and symbol, a prince destroyed not by rebellion or enemies, but by the very institution that crowned him. And yet, his story is not unique. Because a continent away, another monarch was falling into his own spiral. Not in silence, not in secrecy, but with a bang so loud that history named him not by his title, but by his terror. He ruled not with fear, but as fear itself. Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible of Russia, 1530–1584. Some monarchs lose their grip on reality. Ivan IV of Russia crushed his grip so tightly that reality bled. Known to history as Ivan the Terrible, a title that, in the original Russian, Grozny, implies awe and dread more than cruelty, his legacy is a study in contradiction, a visionary reformer and brutal autocrat, a nation builder and a destroyer of families. A man who laid the foundations of the Russian state while simultaneously burning his own soul to do it. Born in 1530, Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow at just 3 years old, after the death of his father, Grand Prince Vasily III. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, acted as regent until she died, allegedly poisoned when Ivan was only 8. What followed was a childhood of aristocratic neglect. The boy prince was raised in the shadowy corners of the Kremlin, shuffled between court factions, largely ignored, and frequently humiliated. He later wrote of watching nobles abuse courtiers and servants, of going hungry while boyars' Russian nobles feasted in front of him. Out of this cauldron of abandonment and humiliation, a child learned the two most enduring lessons of Russian autocracy. Trust no one, and power is safer than love. At age 16, Ivan was crowned the first Tsar of all the Russias, a title deliberately designed to invoke both Caesar and Orthodox divinity. It was more than a coronation. It was a declaration. The Tsar was not merely a ruler, but a sacred figure, ordained by God and answerable only to heaven. And at first, Ivan ruled as a reformer. He created a national assembly, restructured law codes, modernized military service, and established diplomatic relations with Western Europe. But the paranoia never left him. Nor did the trauma. In 1560, after the sudden death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, possibly from poisoning, Ivan unraveled. His personality, already volatile, turned violent. He accused the boyars of murder. He trusted no one. His court turned into a surveillance state. Spies were everywhere. Conspiracies, some real, many imagined, were uncovered weekly. Punishments were severe, public, and theatrical. Then came the Oprichnina. In 1565, Ivan divided Russia into two realms. the regular state, governed by traditional laws, and the oprichnina, a shadow realm under his personal control. He created a private army, the oprichniki, who wore black robes, carried dogs' heads on their saddles, and were tasked with rooting out treason. Their methods were brutal. Entire towns were massacred. Nobles were tortured. Lands were seized. Loyalty was not rewarded, only the appearance of loyalty. Ivan called it purification. Historians now call it state terror. And through it all, Ivan's mental state deteriorated. He suffered violent rages, paranoid episodes, religious ecstasies, and deep depressions. He fasted obsessively. He lashed out unpredictably. He wrote long, rambling letters filled with biblical references and political threats. His personality veered between divine conviction and bottomless suspicion. The most infamous moment came in 1581, during an argument with his son and heir, also named Ivan. In a fit of rage, Ivan struck his son in the head fatally. The death of the Tsarevich devastated the Tsar. Eyewitnesses claim he wept uncontrollably at his son's side, but the damage was done not just to his family, but to the succession. When Ivan died 3 years later, Russia was left with a feeble heir and no clear path forward. The result, the time of troubles, a period of chaos, famine, and foreign invasion. Ivan the Terrible remains one of history's most complex studies in sovereign madness. His cruelty wasn't senseless, it was ritualized. His terror wasn't spontaneous, it was systematized. He didn't lose his mind all at once, he weaponized it, slowly, methodically, until paranoia became law and grief became governance. He ruled for over 50 years, and when he died, the Russian court didn't breathe a sigh of relief. They inhaled the fear he left behind. Because Ivan proved what every empire secretly fears, that the madman with the crown doesn't always fall. Sometimes he just builds a throne tall enough to make the madness look like vision. Queen Elizabeth I, 1533-1603 speculative. The Virgin Queen, Gloriana, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Master of War, Propaganda, Fashion, and Delay. Elizabeth I reigned for 44 years and transformed England from a fractious, vulnerable island kingdom into a maritime superpower. Her portraits show a woman rendered almost mythic, draped in pearls, pressed into stiff lace, eyes fixed on eternity. But behind the veil of sovereign power, behind the careful layers of public performance, some historians have asked a quieter question. Did she come undone in the end? To be clear, Elizabeth I was not officially considered mad. There are no proclamations of instability, no whispered court plots to remove her on psychiatric grounds, no well-documented episodes of psychosis or break from reality. But there are moments, especially in her later years, that have drawn speculation. And as with so many monarchs, speculation grows best in silence. She began her reign in 1558 at the age of 25, inheriting a fractured nation, torn between Protestantism and Catholicism, threatened by foreign powers, and haunted by the reign of her half-sister Mary, known to posterity as Bloody Mary. Elizabeth ruled with careful pragmatism, balancing court factions, foreign suitors, and theological warfare with impressive steadiness. Her refusal to marry, turning personal autonomy into national policy, was framed as virtue and mythologized as virginity. In truth, it may have been an early act of self-preservation. But what happens to a ruler who builds an empire on self-denial? By the 1592, Elizabeth was in her 60s, ancient by the standards of Tudor England. Her closest advisors were dying. The generation that had grown up with her was vanishing. The golden halo that had once glowed around her image began to tarnish. She lost teeth, hair, and weight. She insisted on thick layers of makeup to cover signs of aging. Servants recorded hours of mirror gazing followed by violent outbursts, anxiety over her appearance, and mounting paranoia about betrayal within her court. The death of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, her rebellious favourite turned enemy, seems to have struck her particularly hard. After his execution for treason in 1601, Elizabeth reportedly became withdrawn and silent. She ceased eating regularly. She refused medical care. She began pacing the palace corridors at night. At one point, she stood motionless for hours, unwilling to lie down or be moved. These may not be signs of madness in a clinical sense, but they do hint at deep psychological decline. Modern biographers have pointed to depression, emotional burnout, or prolonged grief disorder. Some speculate that the long years of performative strength, years spent denying her body, her desires, her vulnerabilities, simply reached a breaking point. There are no direct records of hallucinations or delusions, but the final weeks of her life were shrouded in confusion. She reportedly sat on a cushion for days, refusing to speak, eat, or sleep. Her courtiers were terrified. Physicians suggested illness. Others believed she had simply lost the will to live. She died in March of 1603, after refusing to name a successor until the last moment. So was it madness, or simply the erosion of a psyche exhausted by 4 decades of power? The truth may lie in what Elizabeth refused to give up until the very end. The performance, the mask, the crown as identity. And perhaps the cost of building your soul into a nation is that once the nation no longer needs you, there's nothing left of the soul. Still, her final silence says something. The woman who once gave fiery speeches to troops at Tilbury, who outwitted Spain and the Pope, who wrote poetry in the margins of diplomacy, died wordlessly, surrounded by men who couldn't look her in the eye. She did not go mad by the standards of history, but perhaps she lived too long inside the performance to escape it. And in Spain, her former suitor and eternal rival, another monarch, was losing his grip not gradually, not theatrically, but in tides. A king whose mind came and went like a shadow at high noon, and whose reign would leave Spain wondering if power itself might be the illness. Philip V of Spain, 1683-1746. When Philip V ascended the Spanish throne in 1700, he was 17 years old, French by birth, and genetically fated for instability. He was the grandson of Louis XIV of France, and his ascension triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict sparked not by ideology or resources, but by blood. Too many monarchs were dying childless, and Europe, ever the polite chaos machine, had no idea what to do with that vacuum. The Spanish Empire, massive and fractured, landed in Philip's lap like a dying elephant. His inheritance was gilded, but not golden. From the beginning, Philip was tense, devout, serious, and awkward in public. He lacked the charisma of his Bourbon ancestors. What he did possess, in abundance, was a deep sense of unworthiness. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, prayed obsessively. He fasted irregularly and suffered from insomnia, anxiety, and what courtiers described as melancholic torpor. Philip wasn't so much mad in the theatrical sense as he was overwhelmed by the machinery of monarchy. The court tried to shield him, but it was difficult. The War of the Spanish Succession dragged on for over a decade, during which Philip's behavior began to shift. He was prone to long silences. He retreated into his private chapel for hours. He wept during council meetings. He often refused to dress, wandering his chambers in nightclothes, issuing edicts at midnight, and conducting business from his bed. By 1724, he had had enough. In an almost unprecedented move, Philip abdicated. Officially, it was framed as a devout gesture to focus on prayer and the salvation of his soul. Privately, his mental and emotional state had become increasingly erratic. He suffered intense mood swings, believed he was being spied on, and experienced severe panic attacks. He handed the throne to his 6-year-old son, Louis. And then, 6 months later, Louis died. Philip returned to the throne, reluctantly, mournfully, and not entirely lucid. His second reign was darker. He became increasingly reclusive, allowing his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, to manage much of the state. Philip became obsessed with ritual and religion. His religious fervor intensified to the point of dysfunction. He reportedly performed daily flagellations, confessed multiple times a day, and surrounded himself with apocalyptic literature. Medical historians now suggest bipolar disorder, possibly compounded by neurological illness. His symptoms included lethargy, bursts of irrational anger, physical tremors, and long periods of silence where he refused food or conversation. Foreign ambassadors reported that Philip would spend hours in bed, speaking only to priests. His ministers were forced to approach him lying down. He would not rise, even for matters of state. At times, he claimed to be communicating directly with God. At others, he could barely speak. Yet despite this, he reigned for decades. Spain survived him not because of his leadership, but in spite of it. Philip V died in 1746, after one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. His son, Ferdinand VI, would inherit a quieter court and would, in time, struggle with his own breakdown. But Philip's legacy lingered in more than blood. He proved that a monarch could disappear into religious ecstasy, into depressive silence, into psychological shadows, and the empire would still stumble forward. Governance, it turned out, could function around an empty chair. Or at least pretend to. And when pretending stops being enough, sometimes the empire stops pretending too. As it did with the next monarch, an emperor so fragile that his title existed largely as a formality. A man who was king in name, but whose mind had been written off long before his coronation was even confirmed. Ferdinand I, 1793–1875. Few monarchs have embodied the term figurehead as fully and as tragically as Ferdinand I of Austria. He was emperor in title, but in practice, his reign was a carefully choreographed illusion, stage-managed by relatives and ministers who had long since decided that his mind was too fragile to be trusted with power. Born in 1793 into the Habsburg dynasty, Ferdinand arrived into a lineage already cracking under the weight of its own inheritance. The Habsburgs had ruled for centuries by marrying within their own bloodlines, so much so that by the time Ferdinand was born, he was less a political leader in waiting and more a walking, wheezing testament to genetic redundancy. He was born with a range of health problems: hydrocephalus, epilepsy, a speech impediment, and significant developmental delays. His head was unusually large. He drooled. He had difficulty speaking. He suffered from violent seizures and needed constant supervision. The royal court tried to downplay these issues. After all, this was the heir, but even in a world that prized ritual over realism, Ferdinand was visibly unwell. And yet, the machinery of monarchy moved forward because it had to. When his father, Emperor Francis I, died in 1835, Ferdinand became Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and King of Bohemia, among other titles. The coronation went forward with pomp and gold-threaded vestments. The crowds cheered, the aristocracy bowed, and, behind the scenes, a regency council quietly took control of everything. It was an open secret. Ferdinand could not rule. He was emotionally erratic, mentally limited, and frequently ill. His speech was difficult to understand, and he rarely grasped the details of state matters. He signed laws, but only when told. He attended audiences, but said little. His doctors continued to monitor his seizures, which could be triggered by stress, fatigue, or simply the flicker of candlelight. Ministers created a political fiction. Ferdinand was emperor, but real power was held by a council led by Prince Metternich, the iron-fisted architect of post-Napoleonic Europe. Metternich had no illusions about Ferdinand's capabilities, but he did have an interest in preserving dynastic continuity, so the empire functioned, just barely. Ferdinand, to his credit, seems to have had moments of self-awareness. He is said to have once remarked, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings," in response to being denied a second helping at dinner. Another time, after being told he had to abdicate, he allegedly replied, "Well, I can't rule, so that's fine." These quotes, half humorous, half sad, reflect a man who knew his title didn't match his life. Then came 1848. That year, revolution exploded across Europe. The Austrian Empire, long a patchwork of resentments and forced alliances, began to fracture. In Vienna, protests surged. In Hungary, calls for autonomy grew louder. The imperial court panicked. The illusion of stability could no longer hold. Metternich fled. Ferdinand, bewildered and unfit to respond to the moment, became a liability. The court decided that the only way to preserve the dynasty was for Ferdinand to abdicate. In December 1848, under heavy pressure, he stepped down. His nephew, Franz Joseph, took the throne young, strong, and capable of completing sentences. Ferdinand lived nearly 30 more years in quiet retirement at Prague Castle. He remained under light supervision, living a life of routines and rituals. He played music. He painted. He was reportedly fond of mechanical toys and birds. The empire moved on without him. His reign had lasted 13 years, and yet, in political terms, it had never truly begun. Ferdinand's story is not a scandal. It is not dramatic. It is not violent, and that may be what makes it so haunting. His madness, or more accurately, his cognitive impairment was not denied, punished, or even hidden. It was simply ignored, woven into the ceremony of empire like an inconvenient thread no one wanted to pull. He was crowned, he ruled, he was removed, and history kept walking. But the idea of a monarch as performance, a man made sacred not by ability, but by blood, didn't die with Ferdinand. Because in Britain, another such man would rise. A king in waiting, plagued not by seizures or delay, but by something more elusive, instability, emotion, contradiction, and a crown that came too late to mean anything at all. George IV of the United Kingdom, 1762, 1830. George IV wasn't mad in the medical sense, not always. He wasn't removed from the throne. He wasn't locked away. But madness, in his case, was ambient, atmospheric, a haze of delusion, addiction, insecurity, and grandeur that followed him like a perfume, overpowering, artificial, and impossible to ignore. Born in 1762, the eldest son of George III and Queen Charlotte, young George was bred for duty. He received the best education, fluent in several languages, studied classical literature, and was surrounded by portraits of ancestors who looked more myth than man. But from early on, He resisted the burden placed upon him. Where his father was sober and frugal, George was flamboyant and excessive. He drank, he gambled. He commissioned portraits of himself in full military attire before ever seeing a battlefield. The contradictions defined him. As Prince of Wales, he openly feuded with his father, whose own mental health was notoriously unstable. George III's episodes of psychosis, possibly caused by porphyria or bipolar disorder, meant that young George grew up in a palace where public silence and private panic were standard practice. It's unclear what effect this had on him, but by his 20s, George IV was already manifesting symptoms of emotional instability, paranoia, and compulsive behavior. He fell into debt, colossal, eye-watering debt, buying art, horses, mistresses, and waistcoats too ornate to be believed. He cultivated a personal style that bordered on parody: powdered wigs, velvet robes, and custom-designed uniforms. He ate to excess, drank to unconsciousness, and spent money as if reality were a rumor. In 1811, after one of George III's most severe mental collapses, George IV was appointed Prince Regent. It was an eerie symmetry. The son now ruled in the name of a father who no longer recognized him. And he loved it. As regent, George indulged in fantasy. He transformed Carlton House into a palace of theatrical splendor. He commissioned the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, a bizarre, opulent, Indo-Saracenic fever dream of domes, minarets, and painted dragons. He surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants. Court records describe dramatic mood swings, obsessive outbursts over minor slights, and long periods of withdrawal. He was deeply insecure about his appearance, wearing elaborate corsets, using cosmetics to hide his aging face, and famously posing for portraits that bore no resemblance to reality. One visitor wrote, "He is a ruin of a man who has not yet realized he is falling." Beneath the flamboyance lay profound emotional instability. He would weep during meetings. He suspected his staff of plotting against him. He refused to see certain ministers based on dreams he claimed were prophetic. He became obsessed with his own legacy, commissioning paintings of himself as if he were already a legendary figure. He fabricated military victories, exaggerated illnesses, and rewrote the story of his life as he went. By the time he officially became king in 1820, he was bloated, erratic, and increasingly disconnected from the business of rule. He spent much of his reign in seclusion. Parliament functioned without him. His ministers treated him as a formality. He was, in many ways, a monarch who had become his own illusion. George IV died in 1830, swollen with gout, surrounded by luxuries he no longer enjoyed, and largely unloved by his people. His death was noted, his funeral held, and the court moved on more relieved than bereaved. What makes George IV unsettling isn't just his instability, but how normal it became, how the palace adjusted, how the government ignored the outbursts, how the crown continued uninterrupted. He was not mad in a vacuum. He was mad within a system designed to absorb madness and carry on. And in a darker, earlier century, another such man had worn the crown in silence. A king about whom we know almost nothing except that he sat alone, ignored, and possibly terrified of what the crown had done to him. Alfonso II of Asturias, 759-842 speculative. The early medieval Iberian Peninsula was a place of borders, between kingdoms, between faiths, between the known world and the imagined one. It was a land of shifting alliances and half-remembered lineages, where kings often wore iron crowns and woolen cloaks, and a reign could vanish into legend as quickly as it was recorded. Alfonso II of Asturias, also called Alfonso the Chaste, lived and ruled in such a time. He reigned over the Christian kingdom of Asturias from roughly 791 until his death in 842, a period defined by persistent conflict with Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus to the south and the ever-tenuous cohesion of Christian principalities to the north. He was one of the earliest monarchs to consolidate political and religious identity under a Christian banner during the Reconquista. And yet, despite his significance in early Spanish history, there's a strange silence that creeps into the record, an ambiguity that has led some to speculate about his state of mind. The title The Chaste tells part of the story. Alfonso never married, he had no children. There were no royal mistresses, no disputed heirs, no love letters or courtly scandals, nothing but the monastic chill of solitude. Chroniclers at the time interpreted this as piety, a king devoted to God, a sovereign above earthly temptation. But not everyone agreed. Some later accounts, written centuries after his death, but drawing from regional oral traditions, suggest that Alfonso may have been afflicted with emotional instability. They describe a man withdrawn from court, often melancholic, obsessive in religious matters, and deeply paranoid about betrayal. One particularly persistent story claims that he confined himself to a remote chamber in Oviedo for months at a time, receiving only a handful of servants and priests. Another claims he insisted on personally inspecting his own food, believing it to be poisoned even when no plots had been discovered. Of course, medieval monarchs were often isolated. It was part of the role, but Alfonso's seclusion seemed to extend beyond ceremony. Some interpretations suggest he suffered from long bouts of depression, or what older texts simply called melancholia. It wasn't dramatic, like the fits or frenzies of other monarchs. It was quiet, slow, and systemic, a spiritual weight that turned into a political one. And it left a vacuum. His court, already small and dominated by clerical advisors, began to function in his absence. The bishops gained power. The church took on a greater share of administrative control. Meanwhile, military decisions were increasingly delegated to counts and regional leaders. Alfonso issued edicts, but rarely appeared in public. His rule became more symbolic than strategic. Still, his reign wasn't without consequence. Under his watch, the Kingdom of Asturias solidified its claim as a Christian bastion. He moved the capital to Oviedo and began the construction of churches and monasteries. He promoted the cult of St. James, possibly as a means of uniting the Christian kingdoms through shared religious identity. Some historians even credit Alfonso with laying the groundwork for the legend of Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer, an image that would fuel the Reconquista for centuries. But if Alfonso was a visionary, he was also perhaps a prisoner of that vision. There are accounts of him ordering public prayers for signs of divine favor during dry seasons. Others suggest he believed that dreams were direct communications from God and structured entire court sessions around them. One letter, attributed to a bishop of the time, gently warns that the king has grown increasingly silent, speaking only of visions. When he died in 842, the throne passed not to a son there was none but to his cousin, Ramiro I. The transition was orderly, but the legacy was murky. Alfonso was buried in Oviedo, near the cathedral he had built. No dramatic scandals, no wars of succession, just the end of a long, quiet reign, wrapped in reverence and a faint sense of unease. Today, scholars still debate whether Alfonso's childlessness and reclusion were signs of religious devotion or symptoms of a psychological condition that went unspoken in a time before such things had names. In the end, Alfonso II remains more silhouette than portrait, a man surrounded by bishops and monks, looking to heaven for answers he could not find among men. His madness, if it existed, was not shouted or feared. It was endured, institutionalized, and finally sanctified. But the same could not be said for the monarch who followed in our list. For him, the cracks in the mind would not be softened by monastic silence. They would echo through a country already coming apart, where politics and delusion waltzed across the marble floors of collapsing palaces. Constantine, I of Greece, 1868, 1923, speculative. Greece, in the early 20th century, was not so much a kingdom as it was a political weather system, unstable, shifting, and ready to break at the wrong pressure point. Into this tempest stepped Constantine, high-crowned not only with a royal diadem, but with the burden of impossible choices. He would rule, abdicate, return, and fall again, all while rumors swirled that the real battle was not on the front lines, but in his own head. Born in 1868 to King George I of Greece and Queen Olga of Russia, Constantine was educated in Germany and groomed for military leadership. He married Princess Sophia of Prussia, granddaughter of Queen Victoria and sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, cementing both familial and ideological ties to the German monarchy. These ties would later prove catastrophic. During the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, Constantine led Greek forces to victory and was hailed as a national hero. He was decisive, charismatic in uniform, and briefly adored. But war has a way of reshaping men, and the Constantine who returned from the battlefield was not quite the same as the one who had left. Close aides noted mood changes, deepening anxiety, and an obsession with fate. Some claimed he became increasingly withdrawn, retreating from public duties for days at a time. Then came World War I and the unraveling. Greece was divided. Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos supported the Allies. Constantine, influenced by his German ties and belief in strict neutrality, refused. What followed was the National Schism, a political and cultural rift that split the country in two. Two governments, two ideologies, two visions of Greece's future. And in the middle, Constantine. The king's behavior during this period began to raise eyebrows. He reportedly spent hours pacing the royal gardens, muttering about betrayal. He issued contradictory orders to the military. He isolated himself from ministers, trusting only a small circle of advisors and family members. Some foreign diplomats described him as erratic, brooding, and unstable under pressure. Others noted his increasing reliance on religious rituals and omens before making decisions. In 1917, the Allies, tired of the stalemate, forced Constantine to abdicate. His son, Alexander, was installed as king. Constantine went into exile, reportedly suffering from chronic depression and episodes of paranoia. Letters from this time show a man obsessed with redemption, fate, and the idea that he had been crucified for political sins not his own. In 1920, after his son's sudden death from an infected monkey, bite yes, really Constantine was recalled to the throne by popular vote. Greece, exhausted by war and looking for a symbol of continuity, welcomed him back, but he was no longer the man of the Balkan Wars. The second reign was a disaster. Greece launched a military campaign in Asia Minor, an attempt to reclaim historic territories. It ended in catastrophe. The army was routed, Smyrna burned. Thousands of civilians died or were displaced. Constantine's indecision, isolation, and apparent mental fatigue were blamed by many for the outcome. His ministers pleaded for clear leadership. Instead, they got silence, confusion, delay. In 1922, after yet another military coup, Constantine abdicated for a second time, this time in disgrace. He died a year later in exile in Sicily, far from Athens, surrounded by the last tatters of royal legitimacy. No formal diagnosis was ever given, but modern historians have speculated that Constantine may have suffered from untreated depression, possibly a trauma-related condition exacerbated by years of warfare, public failure, and political exile. He was a monarch caught between worlds, ancient loyalty and modern politics, military valor and emotional fragility. And in the end, like so many before him, he became a symbol not of governance, but of decline. Because when a crown weighs too heavily, it doesn't just bend the neck, it bends the mind. And sometimes it breaks both. Charles II of Spain, 1661–1700. If you wanted to know what inbreeding looked like when placed on a throne and wrapped in royal garments, Charles II of Spain would have been the portrait. He was the last Habsburg monarch of the Spanish Empire, the tail end of a centuries-long family experiment in dynastic isolation, an attempt to keep the bloodlines pure by marrying relatives over and over again until the family tree resembled a noose. Charles was born into this noble entanglement in 1661, and he wore the consequences not metaphorically, but physically, mentally, and institutionally. He was crowned king at the age of 4, though he had trouble speaking, couldn't walk until he was almost 8, and struggled to chew his food without assistance well into adulthood. His face was dominated by the infamous Habsburg jaw so pronounced he could barely close his mouth, and his tongue was reportedly so large that speech was often incomprehensible. But Charles's most debilitating impairments weren't visible. They were neurological, cognitive, and, perhaps most tragically, emotional. The royal court refused to admit this. After all, in the rigid choreography of empire, a king does not suffer, a king reigns. And so the boy king was presented to the public as a miracle child, while behind closed doors, tutors and priests scrambled to coax coherence from a mind that remained frustratingly, frighteningly adrift. Modern historians and geneticists have suggested that Charles II likely suffered from multiple congenital disorders, exacerbated by the Habsburg dynasty's generational self-pairing. Cognitive delay, developmental disorders, immune deficiencies, and epilepsy have all been proposed. His medical records read like the punchline to a cruel divine joke. Weak constitution, chronic fever, hallucinations, and what one court doctor delicately described as an absence of vigor, both mental and moral. But of course, none of this stopped the machinery of monarchy. Charles was, by law and theology, the representative of God on earth. So even if he struggled to remember the names of his ministers or to read the documents they placed before him, his signature remained legally binding. That meant someone else had to control his hand. His mother, Mariana of Austria, effectively ruled during his minority. She doted on him and shielded him from political stress while consolidating power for herself. This didn't prepare him for leadership, it merely delayed the realization that he wasn't capable of it. When he came of age, or rather, when the regency could no longer be justified, Charles assumed nominal control, but the court had already developed a kind of ritualized denial. Ministers kept decisions short and ceremonial. Foreign envoys were politely discouraged from seeking long audiences. Behind his back, Charles was referred to as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, a nickname that captured both pity and fear. Superstitious whispers spread that Charles was cursed, perhaps the victim of black magic, or the embodiment of Spain's divine punishment for sins past. There's no record that Charles disagreed. In his later years, the king reportedly took a deep interest in occult explanations for his condition. He consulted exorcists. He asked to be sprinkled with holy water during meetings. He became increasingly withdrawn, often fasting to the point of collapse and slipping into states of dissociation. His ministers grew frantic. Spain, meanwhile, decayed. By the end of his reign, the empire was a skeleton of its former self. The economy was stagnant. The military was overextended. The succession was in crisis. Charles had no children, 2 marriages, both unconsummated or at least unproductive, and the question of who would follow him became a European obsession. France and Austria, both claiming royal ties, maneuvered for the throne. Diplomats circled like carrion birds. Charles, in a final act of what might have been clarity or confusion, named Philip of Anjou, the Bourbon grandson of Louis XIV, as his heir. When he died in 1700, the War of Spanish Succession exploded across the continent, lasting more than a decade. His body was reportedly exhumed later for a final medical examination. According to dubious sources, his corpse was found to be in a state of unnatural deterioration. His heart too small, his skull full of fluid, his intestines black. Whether true or not, the myth clung to him, just like the nickname, El Hechizado. Not mad in the theatrical sense, not cruel, not tyrannical, just broken, and left on the throne far too long. But while Charles's madness came pre-installed an inheritance of biology and power, our next monarch battled demons that history didn't inscribe in his bones, but perhaps in his conscience. A queen whose reign was short, tumultuous, and often rewritten to serve the needs of rival crowns, and whose mind, like her fate, became the subject of royal speculation. Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542-158, 7 speculative. Few queens in history have inspired more romantic myth, political commentary, and psychological conjecture than Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born into a storm, married into 3 more, and eventually executed for plotting against the English crown. Her life was one long negotiation between power and peril, and through it all, there's been a persistent question lurking beneath the surface. Did she break under it? Mary became Queen of Scots 6 days after her birth, following the death of her father, James V. She was whisked away to France for safety, educated in the glittering courts of Valois royalty, and betrothed to the French Dauphin. She married him at 15. He died 2 years later. Widowed before adulthood, Mary returned to a cold, suspicious Scotland, a land she barely remembered, ruled by men who didn't want her back. From the beginning, Mary's reign was undercut by distrust. She was Catholic in a newly Protestant nation. She was cosmopolitan in a kingdom still feudal in spirit. And worst of all, she was beautiful, articulate, and independent traits that in a queen were often recast as dangerous. Her first major political misstep or psychological unraveling, depending on your perspective, was her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was politically convenient, but personally disastrous. Darnley was arrogant, erratic, and deeply insecure. Their marriage devolved into chaos. He was jealous of Mary's power, possibly abusive, and soon alienated everyone at court. Then he was murdered. The exact circumstances remain a swirl of accusation, speculation, and finger-pointing. The leading suspect was James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man Mary married just weeks after Darnley's death. That marriage unraveled what little political support she had left. Many believed she had been manipulated. Others saw it as evidence of emotional instability. Was it trauma, desperation, or something darker, an inability to see reality through the haze of personal passion? Rebellion followed. Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James VI. She fled to England, seeking protection from her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead, she got imprisonment. For 19 years. Imagine that. A queen, once the most powerful woman in Scotland, reduced to a guest prisoner under watchful eyes. Letters were intercepted. Servants were spies. Every conversation parsed. Her health declined. Her moods reportedly swung between charming optimism and brooding silence. Her correspondence, some of it fevered, some of it eloquent, reveals a mind fighting for relevance and control. Was she depressed? Almost certainly. Was she mad? Harder to say. Mary's enemies certainly believed she was unstable. Elizabeth's ministers painted her as manipulative, emotional, irrational. But her supporters, especially in France and among English Catholics, saw her as tragic, not unwell. Eventually, she was implicated in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Whether she orchestrated it or merely knew of it remains debatable, but the verdict was not. In 1587, she was executed, and with her death, the legend began. Mary became a symbol for Catholics, for romantics, for anyone who ever imagined a ruler too beautiful, too pure, too tragic for politics. But underneath the poetry and martyrdom is a woman who may have suffered deeply, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. A queen surrounded by men who failed her, betrayed by a system that never wanted her to rule. History didn't diagnose her, but it certainly punished her. And as the crown passed to new hands, one man would take it up with an odd smile, a German accent, and the kind of eccentricity that made courtiers whisper and left historians wondering whether instability wasn't just contagious, but hereditary. Tsar Peter III of Russia, 1728-1762. The trouble with being a monarch is that sometimes the crown lands on the wrong head. Not the wrong person politically or ideologically, but the wrong person altogether. Someone not built for court intrigue, nor for the emotional pressures of statecraft, nor even for the psychological theatre of kingship. Tsar Peter III of Russia was one of those people. Born in Kiel, in what was then part of the Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, modern-day Germany, Peter was the grandson of Peter the Great and the heir presumptive to the Russian throne through his mother, Anna Petrovna. But despite this prestigious lineage, he was culturally and temperamentally foreign to the world he would one day be expected to rule. When he was summoned to Russia by his aunt, Empress Elizabeth, and declared her heir, Peter was just a teenager, German-speaking, Lutheran, musically inclined, and politically naive. To his new subjects, he was not so much a prince as a question mark with a noble title. He never quite learned Russian properly. He didn't care to. He had little interest in Orthodox ritual. He preferred toy soldiers, Prussian uniforms, and philosophical doodles over governance. Elizabeth married him off to a minor German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, better known to history as Catherine the Great. From the beginning, it was a mismatch. Peter was immature, self-absorbed, emotionally volatile, and possibly suffering from undiagnosed neurological or psychiatric disorders. Catherine, by contrast, was brilliant, focused, and quietly strategic. She studied the language, read philosophy, wrote plays, and made alliances. Peter played with figurines, literally. Court gossip claimed Peter conducted mock battles late into the night with toy soldiers, dressing them up, giving speeches, and punishing them when they disobeyed. He was reportedly obsessed with Frederick the Great of Prussia, modelling his dress, speech, and military bearing after the Prussian king, much to the confusion of the Russian court, which had suffered greatly during the wars with Prussia. Peter's emotional instability was legendary. He would swing from bursts of excitement to sullen silence. He exhibited impulsive behavior, poor judgment, and a bizarre detachment from reality. His courtiers didn't just question his decisions, they often quietly overrode them. Catherine later wrote, with a blend of irritation and alarm, that Peter had the mind of a child, and not a particularly healthy one. When Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter ascended the throne. His reign lasted exactly 186 days. In that brief window, he alienated nearly every faction in Russian politics. He pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War in a sudden about-face that bewildered his generals. He reversed many of Elizabeth's policies. He ordered church property to be seized, antagonizing the Orthodox clergy. And, perhaps most fatally, he declared admiration for Frederick the Great in open court, dressing his guards in Prussian blue and drilling them according to Prussian doctrine. But Peter's fall wasn't purely political. It was deeply personal. He had antagonized his wife for years, publicly insulting her, parading mistresses through the palace, and threatening to disinherit their son. Catherine had spent over a decade quietly building relationships with the nobility, the military, and key courtiers. She understood power. And she understood that Peter, for all his titles, had none of it. The coup came in July 1762. While Peter was away at a palace retreat, Catherine rode into St. Petersburg in a military uniform, declared herself empress, and seized the throne without firing a shot. Peter was captured, taken to a country estate, and forced to abdicate. He died a week later under mysterious circumstances, officially of hemorrhoidal colic, unofficially of something far less natural. Peter III's reign is often remembered as a footnote, a farcical prelude to Catherine's brilliance, but that does him a disservice. His failure wasn't just incompetence. It was a failure of psychological preparedness. He was a man dropped into a world he did not understand, asked to rule a country he did not love, while wearing a crown that never truly fit. Some historians suggest he may have had a form of high-functioning autism, or suffered from an undiagnosed mood disorder. Others see a man-child with too much power, too little guidance, and no emotional filter. Either way, Peter's mind was not ready for Russia. And Russia, cold and unflinching, was never ready to wait. Because while Peter was playing dress-up in royal halls, another sovereign further north had been living in a palace of contradictions for years, crowned, revered, and profoundly misaligned with her age, her court, and perhaps herself. Queen Christina of Sweden, 1626, 1689 speculative. Queen Christina of Sweden remains one of history's most elusive monarchs, a ruler shaped more by paradox than precedent. She was crowned king in all but name, worshipped as a prodigy, and later condemned as eccentric, unstable, and unfit for rule. Depending on the source, she was a philosopher queen, a rebel, a saint, a scandal, or a woman slowly coming apart beneath a crown that never matched her reflection. Christina was born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus and Queen Maria Eleonora. Her father died in battle when she was just 6, making her the heir to the Swedish throne. Gustavus had no sons, but he had a plan: raise Christina as a prince. And so she was. Educated like a boy, trained in politics, history, philosophy, and the classics. Christina grew up wearing trousers and discussing Aristotle. She reportedly refused to brush her hair, walked with a masculine gait, and scoffed at the expectations of femininity. Courtiers were both enchanted and unsettled. The line between brilliance and impropriety blurred early. She was officially crowned in 1650, and for a brief time, her rule promised to be a golden age of intellect. Christina gathered scholars, artists, and thinkers from across Europe. She corresponded with Descartes, invited Catholic theologians to her Protestant court, and began planning for a Sweden rooted as much in knowledge as in war. But the more Christina leaned into ideas, the further she drifted from politics. She began making erratic decisions. She refused to marry, declaring herself asexual or celibate, depending on the translation, and insisted she would remain sovereign on her own terms. She alienated nobles. She reorganized government offices with little consultation. She ran the treasury dry with her lavish patronage. And slowly, the rumors began to swirl. She was too intense, too moody, too strange. There were reports of dramatic mood swings. She could be effusive one moment, vitriolic the next. She withdrew for days, sometimes weeks, speaking to no one. She expressed existential despair. Some ambassadors described her as possessed by a restless spirit. Others simply called her unwell. By 1654, just 4 years after her coronation, Christina shocked the world by abdicating the throne. Officially, she cited her desire to convert to Catholicism, illegal in Lutheran Sweden. Unofficially, she was exhausted, disillusioned, and possibly unraveling. She left Sweden dressed as a man, adopting the persona of Count Dona and travelling across Europe in a haze of philosophy, art, and reinvention. In Rome, she dazzled the papal court, became a Catholic, and reinvented herself as a cultural patron. She lived in Italy for decades, oscillating between public splendour and private volatility. Her spending habits remained erratic. She burned through inheritances and demanded loans from reluctant benefactors. Her letters from this period range from luminous to unhinged waxing, poetic about divine mysteries, one moment railing against perceived conspiracies the next. She never married, never returned to Sweden, never stopped confounding the people who tried to categorize her. Modern scholars have proposed various retrospective diagnoses: bipolar disorder, gender dysphoria, depression, or complex PTSD. But in many ways, Christina defies diagnosis as much as she defied monarchy. She remains, to this day, a puzzle. Not a mad queen in the tragic sense, nor a tyrant lost to delusion, but a woman who walked away from power not because she couldn't wield it, but because the price of wearing the mask had become too high. Christina once said, "I am neither man nor woman. I am queen." But what she left unsaid was perhaps more revealing, that being queen might have been the loneliest identity of all.